Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we're turning our attention to something so familiar that it almost disappears into the background of daily life. We're going to talk about seeing, not simply looking in the casual way we all do from morning until night, but the actual process by which light enters the eye is shaped, filtered, translated, and passed onward until the world becomes visible to you, is one of those ordinary miracles that rarely pauses to introduce itself. The eye sits quietly in its place, doing its work with such ease that most of us hardly think about it, unless something blurs, stings, or refuses to focus when we want it to. And yet inside that small round structure is a system of transparent layers, muscles, fluids, nerves, and living tissue, all working together with remarkable precision, rather like a very polite team of specialists who never ask for applause. Before we begin, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your little corner of the world. Perhaps the room is dim, perhaps the lights are low, perhaps your eyes are already growing a little heavy after a long day of reading, working, driving, scrolling, squinting, and taking in far more than you consciously notice. If you find this soothing, interesting, or simply a pleasant way to wind down, I would be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this calm little space reach other people who might enjoy drifting off while learning about the quiet machinery inside their own bodies. Now settle in, let the pace slow down, and let us begin at the surface, where light first meets the eye and the long journey towards sight quietly starts. Most of us think of seeing as something immediate. You open your eyes and there is the room, the ceiling, the window, the edge of a blanket, the faint outline of furniture, the glow of a screen, perhaps the soft shape of shadows collecting in the corners. It feels effortless, and because it feels effortless, it feels simple. But seeing is not simple at all. It only seems simple because the system is so practiced. By the time you were an infant, your visual world was already beginning to organize itself through constant use. The eye and the brain learn to cooperate so smoothly that the finished result now arrives without explanation. You do not consciously tell your pupils to adjust, your lens to change shape, or your retina to turn light into electrical signals. You simply live at the receiving end of the final product and call it vision. That is part of what makes eye anatomy so interesting. The eye is not just a window, and it is not a camera in the neat, tidy way people sometimes say. It shares a few broad similarities with a camera, of course. There is an opening that lets light in, a lens that helps focus it, and a sensitive surface that receives the image. But the eye is alive in a way no camera has ever been. It is made of tissue that nourishes itself, muscles that move it, fluids that support it, nerves that connect it, and cells that constantly maintain conditions delicate enough for light to pass through clear structures without too much distortion. It is a piece of living anatomy, not a device. It grows, heals to a degree, ages, changes, tires, and adapts. At the most basic level, seeing begins with light. That may sound obvious, but it is worth sitting with for a moment. Without light, there is no visible world. Objects do not come stamped with brightness of their own, at least not most of them. What you see depends on light reaching them, bouncing off them, and travelling toward your eye. When you look at a book on a table, you are not really seeing the book in some direct magical sense. You are receiving patterns of reflected light that carry information about its shape, colour, edges, and texture. The eye's job is to capture those patterns and begin translating them into a form the nervous system can use. That task starts at the very front of the eye, but before light even reaches the first true anatomical layer, it meets something easy to overlook: the tear film. People often think of tears only in the emotional sense, or as something that appears when the eyes are irritated, but the surface of the eye is normally coated by a very thin, structured layer of fluid all the time. This tear film is not a random bit of wetness. It is essential. It helps keep the surface smooth, protects against drying, carries nutrients, and improves the optical quality of the eye. A rough or dry surface scatters light. A smooth, properly coated surface helps light pass in a more orderly way. So even before we reach the cornea, the eye is already managing the conditions required for clear vision. The cornea is the next major player, and it deserves attention because it does far more than many people realise. The cornea is the clear curved front covering of the eye. It is the part you would touch first if you ever, for some reason, tried to poke your own eye, which I do not recommend on grounds both scientific and personal. The cornea must remain transparent, and that requirement shapes its whole structure. Most tissues in the body can afford to contain blood vessels running through them. The cornea cannot. Blood vessels would interfere with transparency, so the cornea stays avascular, meaning it has no direct blood supply. Instead, it receives oxygen and nutrients from tears and from fluid inside the eye. This is one reason the cornea is such a special tissue. It has to stay alive, healthy, curved and clear, all without cluttering itself up. Its shape matters enormously. In fact, the cornea does most of the eye's focusing work. Many people assume the lens is doing nearly all of that, but the cornea provides the majority of the eye's refractive power. Refraction simply means the bending of light. When light moves from one medium to another, for example from air into the curved surface of the cornea, it bends. That bending helps direct the light inward so it can eventually be focused properly onto the retina at the back of the eye. If the cornea is too steep, too flat, irregular, scarred or misshapen, vision can become blurred or distorted. So the cornea is not just a protective shield. It is an optical structure with very serious responsibilities. Once light has passed through the cornea, it enters the aqueous humor, the clear fluid in the front part of the eye. This fluid fills the space between the cornea and the lens, though it is divided into smaller chambers within that region. It helps maintain pressure inside the eye and provides nutrients to nearby tissues. Pressure matters more than people sometimes think. The eye needs to keep its shape. Too little internal support and its structure would not hold properly. Too much pressure and delicate tissues can be damaged. So the eye is not only an optical organ, it is also a carefully pressurized living globe, maintaining balance while remaining clear enough for light to pass through. Then we reach one of the most recognizable parts of the eye, the iris and pupil. The iris is the colored part. Blue, brown, green, hazel, grey, or something between shades depending on genetics and light. In the center of the iris is the pupil, the dark opening that seems almost like a simple hole cut into the front of the eye. And that is essentially what it is, an opening through which light passes. But it is not fixed. The iris controls pupil size through tiny muscles. In bright conditions, the pupil becomes smaller, restricting the amount of light that enters. In darkness, it widens to allow more light in. It is a beautifully sensible system. Too much light can overwhelm the retina. Too little means not enough information gets through. So the iris acts as a regulator, constantly adjusting access to the interior. This happens automatically. You do not sit there giving internal instructions like a stage manager handling curtains. The nervous system takes care of it. Light levels change. The pupil responds. Emotion can affect it too. Fear, excitement, interest. Even certain drugs can enlarge or constrict the pupils. That is part of why the eyes so often seem expressive. They are not only seeing the world, they're quietly revealing something about the state of the person doing the seeing. Beyond the pupil sits the lens, and this is where many people begin to picture the eye as camera-like. The lens is transparent and flexible, suspended behind the iris. Its job is to fine-tune focus. Unlike the cornea, whose shape is mostly fixed, the lens can change shape. When you look at something far away, the lens can relax into a flatter form. When you look at something close, it becomes rounder. This process is called accommodation. Tiny muscles called the ciliary muscles help make it happen by changing tension on delicate fibers connected to the lens. It is a subtle mechanical system, and when it works well, it lets you shift attention from a distant tree to a nearby page without needing to think about the physics involved. Accommodation is one of those things that becomes easier to appreciate when it starts to decline. As people age, the lens becomes less flexible. That is why many adults eventually notice that close-up reading grows less comfortable. The near work that once happened automatically begins to demand more light, more distance, longer arms, or a pair of reading glasses that initially seem like a rude suggestion from time itself. This condition, called presbyopia, is not a disease in the dramatic sense. It is simply a sign that living tissues change with age. The lens has done many years of shape-shifting and grows stiffer. Once light passes through the lens, it moves through the vitreous humor, the clear gel that fills the large central cavity of the eye. This part of the eye does not receive as much romantic attention as the iris or retina, but it has an important structural role. The vitreous helps the eye keep its form and provides a transparent medium through which light can travel toward the back. It is not empty. It is a gel-like substance, mostly water, but supported by a microscopic framework. With age, changes in the vitreous can lead to floaters, those drifting specks or cobweb-like shapes some people notice moving across their vision. They are often more annoying than dangerous, but they are a reminder that the transparent interior of the eye is not a dead space. It is part of a living, changing organ. Finally, the light reaches the retina, and here the process becomes especially remarkable. The retina lines the back of the eye and functions as the light-sensitive tissue that begins the conversion of optical information into neural signals. If the cornea and lens have been arranging and directing the incoming light, the retina is where that light is detected and translated. It contains specialized cells called photoreceptors, and these come in two main types: rods and cones. Rods are more sensitive to low light. They help with vision in dim conditions and are especially useful for detecting shapes and movement when lighting is poor. They do not provide sharp color vision, but they are excellent at helping you navigate the world when brightness drops. Cones, on the other hand, are responsible for color vision and fine detail. They work best in brighter light and are concentrated particularly in the central part of the retina. This difference explains why your visual experience changes so much between daylight and darkness. In bright daylight, color and detail are rich because cones are highly active. In dim environments, rods take over more of the work, and vision becomes less colorful and less precise. The retina is not a flat sheet in a simplistic sense. It is layered, and the signal processing that begins there is more complex than a simple, on-off response to light. Photoreceptors respond to incoming light, but then several other types of retinal cells help organize and modify the information before it ever leaves the eye. So the retina is not just catching light like photographic paper, it is already doing a surprising amount of computation. Contrast, edges, changes in brightness, and aspects of motion begin to be sorted very early. The eye is not merely forwarding raw footage, it is preparing information before the brain even receives it. There is one especially important region in the retina called the macula, and at the center of that is an even smaller area called the fovea. The fovea is where visual acuity is highest. When you look directly at a word on a page or a person's face, you're trying to place that image on the fovea. This tiny region is densely packed with cones and is built for the sharpest possible detail. Your peripheral vision, by contrast, is useful in a different way. It is broader, less precise, more sensitive to motion, and excellent for alerting you to things outside the center of attention. So the eye is not equally detailed across its entire field. It is organized with priorities. The center sees best in detail. The edges keep watch. And then there is the optic nerve, the great exit route through which visual information leaves the eye. At the point where the optic nerve exits, there are no photoreceptors. That creates what is known as the blind spot. Every human eye has one. Normally you do not notice it because the brain fills in the missing information so effectively, and because the two eyes work together to cover gaps. This is one of the many reasons it becomes clear that seeing is not something done by the eye alone. The eye collects and starts the process, but the brain finishes the job. That finishing work is so seamless that it can be hard to appreciate. The brain takes signals from the retina, routes them along visual pathways, and constructs the experience you call sight. Depth, stability, object recognition, color interpretation, motion tracking, and spatial understanding all depend on processing beyond the eye itself. Your eyes receive light, but your brain gives that light meaning. Without that interpretation, sight as you know it would not exist. There would be signals, yes, but not a coherent world. This also explains why vision is vulnerable in many places along the route. A problem with the cornea can blur incoming light. A problem with the lens can cloud it, as happens in cataracts. A problem with pressure can damage the optic nerve, as in glaucoma. A problem in the retina can interfere with detection. A problem in the visual brain can alter perception even if the eye itself is physically intact. Sight is not the product of one part, but of an entire chain of events. It is teamwork from surface to cortex, and any interruption along the line can change what is experienced. Even eye movement deserves a bit of quiet admiration. Your eyes do not stare passively. They are in motion constantly, guided by extraocular muscles that move each eye with remarkable speed and coordination. Tiny movements help refresh the visual scene and prevent the image from fading. Larger shifts, called saccades, move your gaze quickly from one point to another. Smooth pursuit movements allow you to follow moving objects. The two eyes must also align properly so the brain can combine their input into a single useful view. When coordination is off, double vision or other disturbances can result. Once again, something that feels natural turns out to depend on very active control. Blinking joins that list of quiet achievements. A blink seems insignificant until the eye becomes too dry, irritated, or overexposed. Blinking spreads the tear film, protects the surface, clears tiny debris, and briefly interrupts incoming light so smoothly that you barely notice the world vanishing and returning each time. You blink thousands of times a day, and the act is so well integrated into daily life that it almost disappears from awareness. But if the eye were a theatre, blinking would be the maintenance crew keeping the front glass polished while the show goes on uninterrupted. This is perhaps the strangest thing about the eye. It is delicate, but it is not fragile in the way delicate things often are. It is exposed to dust, air, wind, changing light, fatigue, and endless use. It is moist but must not become too wet, clear but made of living tissue, protected by bone but exposed enough to do its work. It is an organ designed to face the world directly while remaining transparent enough to let the world in. That is an unusual anatomical challenge. Most organs can hide their inner workings. The eye must leave part of itself optically open, and because vision is so constant, people often forget how much adjustment is happening from one moment to the next. Walk from bright sun into a dim room and the system recalibrates. Read something up close, then glance at the far wall, and focus shifts. Turn your head while keeping your eyes fixed on an object, and reflexes help stabilize the image. See a face in low light and your brain fills in likely details from partial information. The experience feels fluid because the system is always changing in response to conditions. In that sense, seeing is not a static event. It is an ongoing negotiation between light, anatomy, and neural interpretation. There is also something quietly humbling about the fact that what you see is never the entire story. The visible spectrum is only a narrow band of electromagnetic radiation. The eye is tuned to the slice of reality most useful for human survival, not to everything that exists. You do not see infrared the way some devices can. You do not see ultraviolet the way certain animals can. You do not detect radio waves, X-rays, or the countless signals moving around you. Human vision is powerful, but it is selective. It shows you a world shaped for a human nervous system. Useful, rich, beautiful, yes, but still partial. That does not make sight less impressive. It makes it more interesting. The eye is not a passive truth machine. It is an evolved biological structure built to gather the kind of information a human body and brain need. It detects contrast, movement, shape, colour, and position well enough to navigate the world, recognise faces, find food, avoid danger, read text, admire sunsets, and occasionally lose a pair of glasses while actively wearing them. It is practical and extraordinary at once. So as we move deeper into this topic, it helps to remember that the eye is both simpler and stranger than people often assume. Simpler, because its basic job is just to guide light toward a sensitive surface. Stranger, because each layer along that path has to remain transparent, curved, nourished, protected, and properly aligned, while the nervous system interprets the result fast enough for life to feel immediate. There is nothing mystical about it, and yet there is something hard not to admire in the ordinary fact that this has been happening quietly inside your head all day long. Right now, if your eyes are open, they are adjusting to whatever light is around you. The pupils are set to a size that suits the room. The corneas are bending incoming light. The lenses are holding some degree of focus. The tear film is smoothing the surface. The retinas are catching the reflected patterns of the world around you. Signals are moving along the optic nerves. The brain is building a scene. All of that is occurring whether you pay attention to it or not. Seeing feels like a single act, but under the surface it is a chain of events, one link depending on the next, each part making the others useful. And that is a good place to pause for now. Right here at the threshold where light has entered, the eye has done its early work, and the first foundations of vision are in place. Because once we have that broad picture in mind, we can begin slowing down even further and spend time with the structures at the front, where the process starts in earnest, and where the clear outer surfaces of the eye quietly determine how well the entire journey begins. Most people go through the day with a very simple feeling about sight. You open your eyes, and there the world is. The room appears, the wall appears, the face of another person appears, a tree outside the window appears. It feels immediate, complete, and so natural that it barely seems like a process at all. But the truth is that seeing is not the same as simply having eyes open. Seeing is an act of interpretation built from light, anatomy, nerve signals, and a very busy brain that does far more guesswork than most of us realise. At first glance, that may sound a little disappointing, as if vision is less direct than it feels. In reality, it is far more interesting. You do not look out at the world the way an empty window looks out onto a street. Your eyes are not just holes in the head that let reality stroll in uninvited. They are living structures that collect a narrow kind of information, shape it carefully, pass it onward, and rely on the brain to turn that incoming stream into something coherent. So when we say that you see a cup on a table, what we really mean is that light has bounced off the cup, entered your eyes, been bent and focused, converted into electrical activity, sent through visual pathways, and assembled into a usable perception that your mind labels as cup. The result feels instant. The machinery behind it is anything but simple. It helps to begin with the thing vision depends on most: light. Without light, there is no ordinary seeing. The visible world exists for you only when light reaches objects and then travels from those objects toward your eyes. If you're sitting in a dim room, you're not seeing the objects because they are politely announcing themselves. You're seeing them because whatever light is present is reflecting off their surfaces and carrying information. A white wall reflects a large amount of incoming light. A dark sweater reflects less. A red book reflects wavelengths of light that we interpret as red more strongly than others. The eye does not pull colour, shape and texture directly out of matter. It receives patterns of reflected light and begins the work of translation. That alone changes the way sight sounds when described carefully. Seeing is not touching the world from a distance. It is receiving light from it, and the light itself is only part of a much larger electromagnetic spectrum. Humans can detect only a small slice of it, the portion we call visible light. There are wavelengths shorter than violet and longer than red that surround us all the time, but human eyes do not register them as visual experience. Some animals live in a somewhat different visual reality because their eyes are tuned differently. Bees can detect ultraviolet patterns on flowers. Certain snakes can sense infrared heat through special organs. Humans, meanwhile, work with the narrow band that proved useful for human survival. So the world you see is real, but it is not everything that exists. It is the part your species is equipped to turn into sight. Once light from the world begins its journey toward you, another important fact becomes clear. The eye is not built to preserve the scene exactly as it exists outside. It is built to create a workable internal version. Light rays spread, scatter, reflect, and arrive from many directions. The eye has to take that messy incoming stream and organize it. That is why the shape and clarity of the eye matter so much. If the light is not directed properly, vision blurs. If transparent tissues become cloudy, vision dims. If the receiving cells at the back of the eye are damaged, the signal weakens or disappears. Seeing depends on order being imposed on light before the brain can do anything useful with it. This is one reason the eye is often compared to a camera, though the comparison only goes so far. Like a camera, the eye takes incoming light, controls how much gets in, and focuses it onto a sensitive surface. But a camera does not heal itself, moisten its own front surface, adjust its biological chemistry, or constantly coordinate with a living brain that is editing the result in real time. The eye is not a machine that stores a neat photograph. It is part of a living system that builds perception on the move. That difference matters. Another thing that surprises people is that vision is not passive. It feels passive because it happens automatically, but it is actually a highly active process. Your eyes are moving all the time, even when you think you're staring steadily at something. Tiny adjustments, quick jumps, and coordinated shifts help gather visual information and keep the image useful. If the visual scene were held perfectly still on the retina for too long, perception would begin to fade. So the system keeps itself active. Seeing requires sampling, updating, and refreshing. It is closer to a conversation between eye and brain than to a still photograph sitting quietly in a frame. Then there is the matter of focus. For sight to work clearly, light from the outside world has to be bent in such a way that it lands properly on the retina, the light-sensitive tissue at the back of the eye. If the eye is too long from front to back or the focusing power is too strong, distant objects blur because the image would come to a focus too early. If the eye is too short or the focusing power too weak, the image would not focus by the time it reaches the retina. This is the basis of nearsightedness and farsightedness. Glasses and contact lenses do not give people new vision. They help redirect incoming light so the eye can do what it was already trying to do. In that sense, even a pair of ordinary glasses is a small act of optical diplomacy. Still, even if light is focused beautifully, that is not yet sight. It is only an image formed inside the eye. The retina must then detect that image and convert light into signals the nervous system can understand. This may be one of the most remarkable transformations in the body. Light, which is physical energy, reaches specialized cells that respond to it chemically and electrically. These cells begin a chain reaction that turns the pattern of incoming light into nerve signals. In other words, the world outside becomes electricity inside. That is not a poetic statement. It is a biological one. Yet even that is not the full story, because the retina is not just a sheet of passive detectors. It begins processing the information immediately. Differences in brightness, contrast, edges, and motion begin to matter early. The eye does not simply mail an untouched image to the brain like an intern delivering a folder across the office. The visual system starts organizing the material before it ever leaves the eye. By the time those signals travel toward the brain, a great deal of shaping has already happened. And once the brain receives the signal, it does what brains do best. It interprets. It compares, it fills gaps, it makes predictions, it stabilizes a world that would otherwise seem shaky and fragmented. Because here is another odd fact about vision. The image formed on the retina is inverted. The light from the outside world is focused upside down and reversed left to right. You do not experience life upside down because the brain does not present the raw retinal image to consciousness. It constructs a useful model of the world from the data it receives. That is why it is more accurate to say that the brain sees through the eyes than that the eyes see alone. This becomes even clearer when we think about how much of vision is interpretation rather than direct copying. Your blind spot is one example. Each eye has a place where the optic nerve exits and where there are no photoreceptors. That means there is a small part of the visual field where no direct information is being collected. Under ordinary circumstances, you do not notice this missing patch at all. The brain fills it in so smoothly that the gap disappears from experience. If vision were a perfect raw recording, the blind spot would be obvious. Instead, the brain edits reality for continuity. It prefers a stable world to an honest patch of visual emptiness. The same kind of editing happens constantly. When lighting changes, the colours of familiar objects still look roughly familiar because the brain corrects for context. A white shirt appears white indoors and outdoors, even though the actual light reflecting from it differs quite a lot depending on the environment. Shadows do not usually confuse you into thinking the world has changed shape every few seconds. Faces remain recognisable from different angles in different light and across different distances. All of this means that seeing is not the simple reception of images. It is the construction of a dependable visual world from incomplete and changing input. That dependable quality is useful, but it also means perception can be fooled. Optical illusions are not silly tricks that exist only in puzzle books. They reveal something important about normal vision. The brain uses rules and shortcuts to make sense of the world quickly. Most of the time, these rules work very well. Occasionally, under specific visual conditions, they produce a misleading result. A line seems longer than it is. A colour looks different depending on its background. A still image appears to move. These are not failures of a broken system. They are clues that normal sight is based on interpretation, expectation, and context. This matters because many people assume seeing means knowing exactly what is out there. But the visual system is not primarily designed to provide philosophical certainty. It is designed to provide useful guidance. It helps you move through space, recognize danger, find food, read expressions, avoid obstacles, and make fast decisions. Efficiency matters. Survival matters. Total objective completeness does not. So human vision is very good at some things and not especially good at others. You notice movement in the corner of your eye better than fine detail there. You see colour best in the centre of your gaze. You can miss obvious things when attention is elsewhere. In fact, one of the strangest truths about vision is that you often fail to see what you're not prepared to notice. Attention plays a major role here. Seeing is influenced not only by what reaches the eyes, but by what the brain decides deserves resources. You can look directly at something and still fail to register it properly if your attention is engaged elsewhere. That is why people sometimes search the kitchen for an item that is sitting in plain view the entire time. Their eyes may receive the information, but the brain does not give it enough priority to create full awareness. This sounds absurd until it happens to you while your glasses are on your face and you're accusing the furniture of hiding them. There is also the fact that the two eyes are not simply duplicates of each other. They work together to give depth information. Because your eyes sit slightly apart, each one receives a slightly different view of the world. The brain compares those views and uses the differences to judge distance. This is one of the foundations of binocular vision. It helps explain why catching a ball, stepping off a curb, threading a needle, and pouring tea into a cup without decorating the table all depend on coordinated input from both eyes and the brain's ability to combine them. When the eyes are not aligned properly, or when one eye is not contributing effectively, depth perception can be reduced or altered. Even the sense of visual stability that you enjoy from moment to moment is not as straightforward as it feels. Your eyes move frequently in small and large ways, and yet the world does not seem to jump every time your gaze shifts. The brain compensates for those movements. It knows, in effect, that the eyes have moved and adjusts your perception accordingly. Without that correction, daily life would feel visually chaotic. So once again, what you experience as simple and stable is actually the result of constant hidden correction. Colour is another good example of how seeing is more than receiving light. Colour does not exist inside objects in the tidy way language sometimes suggests. Objects have surfaces that reflect some wavelengths more than others, but colour as you experience it is a product of how your visual system interprets those wavelengths. Different lighting changes the actual wavelengths reaching your eye, and yet the brain maintains a degree of colour constancy. This is useful, because otherwise a banana under morning light and a banana under evening light might seem like different species of fruit altogether. Instead, the system aims for consistency. The banana remains banana-like, and civilization continues. All of this tells us something important. To see is not merely to have eyes. To see is to participate in a chain of events. Light must exist. It must reflect from the world. The front of the eye must admit it. The optical structures must focus it. The retina must detect it. Signals must travel along intact pathways. The brain must organize and interpret those signals. Attention must play its part. Memory must contribute recognition. And then, only then, does conscious sight arrive with that effortless feeling we usually mistake for simplicity. This is why problems with vision can arise from so many different places. The issue may be at the surface of the eye, where dryness disrupts clarity. It may be in the focusing system, where light no longer lands correctly. It may be in the lens, which can become cloudy over time. It may be in the retina, where the light signal should be detected. It may be in the optic nerve, which carries the information onward. Or it may be in the brain, where visual information is interpreted. When people speak casually about bad eyes, what they often mean is that somewhere along this long chain, the process has become less smooth. And yet for most of the day, for most people, the system is astonishingly dependable. You wake up and the room appears. You glance at the time and can read it. You walk through a doorway without needing a physics lecture. You recognize faces, navigate crowded spaces, detect motion, judge distance, and shift attention from screen to street to spoon to sky, all with almost no awareness of the vast amount of biology involved. That may be the most impressive part. The process is not only complex, it is quiet. It runs without fanfare. It does not announce each optical adjustment like a very self-important tour guide. It simply does the work. There is something calming in that. The body is full of systems that carry on without applause, and the visual system is one of the finest examples. The eyes do not merely decorate the face. They are active gateways, collecting information from the outer world with extraordinary speed and precision. But they are also only the beginning. What you call sight is the finished product of cooperation between light, tissue, nerve, and brain. It is not a snapshot. It is a living construction. So when we say, very simply, that you see a candle, a page, a ceiling, or the dark outline of a chair in the corner of the room, it helps to remember what that sentence is quietly covering up. It is covering up reflected light, optical bending, pupil control, retinal chemistry, neural coding, binocular coordination, brain interpretation, attention, memory, and the ongoing effort to turn a changing stream of information into a stable world you can trust. That is what it really means to see. And once that broad idea is in place, the next step is to move closer to the front of the eye itself, because before the retina can detect anything, and before the brain can make meaning out of it, light has to cross the clear outer boundary, where vision truly begins in physical terms, passing over the smooth, tear-coated surface and into the transparent structures that first admit the world. If sight begins anywhere in physical terms, it begins here, at the very front of the eye, where light first arrives and meets a surface that must do several difficult jobs at once. It must remain smooth enough for clear vision, strong enough to protect what lies behind it, sensitive enough to detect trouble quickly, and transparent enough not to get in the way of the very thing it is helping to admit. That surface is not just the cornea by itself, and it is not just a watery gloss over the eye, it is a carefully maintained entrance system made of tears, living cells, and a clear curved structure that begins shaping light almost the moment it touches the eye. Most people do not spend much time thinking about this part unless something goes wrong. A dry eye, a bit of grit, a scratched surface, an infection, a contact lens that suddenly feels like it has developed opinions of its own. Then the front of the eye becomes impossible to ignore. But when it is working well, it disappears into the process, doing its work so quietly that the world seems to come in without resistance. The very first thing light usually meets is not the solid tissue of the cornea, but the tear film coating it. That may sound like a tiny detail, but it is not. The tear film is essential to clear vision. People often imagine tears as something produced only when emotions rise, or when the eye becomes irritated, but the eye is always covered by a delicate layer of fluid. Without it, the surface of the cornea would not remain optically smooth, and vision would suffer surprisingly quickly. The tear film is not there merely to make the eye feel wet. It is there to keep the front of the eye healthy, clear, nourished, protected, and ready for light. This tear film is not just one uniform layer of plain water. It is better thought of as a structured coating with different components that each serve a purpose. The outermost part helps reduce evaporation, rather like putting a lid on a pot so the contents do not vanish too quickly. This oily component comes largely from glands in the eyelids called meibomian glands. When these glands do not function properly, tears may evaporate too fast and the surface of the eye can become dry even if there is technically enough fluid present. That is one of the slightly unfair features of dry eye. It is not always a simple shortage problem. Sometimes the eye has tears, but the tears are not staying put in the right way. Beneath that outer oily layer sits the watery portion, produced mainly by the lacrimal glands. This is the part most people picture when they think of tears. It carries oxygen, nutrients, and protective substances across the eye's surface. It also helps wash away small particles, microbes, and debris. If the surface of the eye had to fend for itself without this fluid exchange, it would be rather like a window left exposed through wind, dust, and weather without ever being cleaned. The watery layer gives the front of the eye both moisture and maintenance. Closest to the eye itself is a mucus component that helps the tear film spread evenly over the corneal surface. The front of the eye is not naturally a perfect sheet of polished glass. This inner layer helps make it behave more like one. It allows the tear film to coat the surface smoothly, instead of beading up and leaving dry patches. That smoothness matters because light behaves poorly when it strikes an irregular surface. A rough tear film scatters light. A stable tear film helps preserve clarity. So before the cornea has even done its refractive work, the tear film has already made a major contribution to vision. Blinking keeps this system refreshed. Every blink spreads the tear film across the eye again, redistributing moisture, smoothing the surface, and clearing away minor debris. Most people blink without thinking, somewhere around 15 to 20 times a minute under ordinary conditions, though the number shifts depending on attention, fatigue, screen use, and environment. One of the reasons eyes can feel dry after long periods of reading or staring at a screen is that people tend to blink less completely and less frequently when absorbed in close visual tasks. The eye then loses some of its normal maintenance rhythm. The surface becomes patchier, the tear film breaks up faster, and vision may fluctuate in a way that feels slightly absurd. You can be looking at the same sentence, but one moment it is sharp and the next it is faintly smeared, as though the text itself has grown tired. That idea of the tear film as an optical surface is worth holding on to. because it explains why a dry eye can affect vision even when the deeper structures are perfectly fine. If the front coating is unstable, the incoming light is already being disturbed before it reaches the cornea in proper fashion. A small irregularity at the front can make the entire image feel less crisp. It is a bit like trying to look through a clean window versus a window with uneven streaks. The scene outside has not changed, but the quality of transmission has. Now, just beneath that tear film lies the cornea, the clear curved structure that forms the front wall of the eye. The cornea is often described as a kind of window, which is useful up to a point, but it is a highly specialized living tissue, not an inert pane. It is transparent, yes, but it is also layered, responsive, and full of biological demands. It must allow light through while preserving a precise curvature. It must remain clear despite being exposed to the outside world. It must resist infection, heal from minor injuries, and stay properly hydrated without swelling so much that its transparency is lost. It has a demanding job description. The cornea is also one of the most important refractive structures in the entire visual system. In everyday language, this means it bends light. In fact, it provides most of the eye's focusing power. Many people assume the lens behind the pupil does the main job because the lens is so often mentioned in school diagrams and casual explanations. But the cornea does the heavy lifting at the front. When light travels from air into the curved corneal surface, its speed changes, and that change causes bending. The particular curvature and clarity of the cornea help direct light inward toward the retina. If the cornea were flatter, steeper, scarred, swollen, or irregular, the image quality would change. So the cornea is not merely a protective outer shell, it is a major optical element. This is one reason corneal shape matters so much in common vision conditions. In nearsightedness, farsightedness, and astigmatism, the way light is bent and focused does not land quite right on the retina. The overall length of the eye matters, and other structures matter too, but the cornea plays a large role. Astigmatism in particular often involves the cornea being shaped more like part of a rugby ball than a perfect round dome, so light does not focus evenly in all directions. The result is blur or distortion. Glasses, contact lenses, and certain surgeries can help correct for these optical mismatches by changing how light is directed before it reaches the back of the eye. To understand why the cornea can do this so effectively, it helps to know a little about its structure. The cornea is made of several layers, each with a different role. At the very front is the epithelium, a thin outer layer of cells that acts as a barrier. This layer protects against dust, microbes, and minor injuries. It is also one of the parts that heals relatively quickly when small scratches occur. If someone gets a tiny corneal abrasion, it can feel dramatic because the cornea is extremely sensitive, but the epithelium often repairs itself with impressive speed. The eye likes to complain loudly, but it also tries hard to recover. Beneath the epithelium is a thin supporting layer, and beneath that lies the stroma, which makes up most of the cornea's thickness. The stroma is especially important for transparency. It is made of collagen fibers arranged in a very regular pattern. That regularity is not decorative, it is essential. When collagen fibers are organized in a precise way, light can pass through with minimal scattering. If that structure is disrupted by scarring, swelling, or disease, the cornea may become cloudy or distorted. So the cornea's transparency is not simply a matter of being clear by luck, it is a consequence of highly ordered microscopic architecture. Deeper still are additional layers including the endothelium, a single layer of cells lining the inner surface of the cornea. These cells do something vital and rather underappreciated. They help pump fluid out of the cornea to keep it from becoming too waterlogged. This matters because the cornea needs to stay at a very specific level of hydration. Too dry is a problem at the surface, but too much water inside the corneal tissue is also a problem because swelling disrupts the orderly arrangement that allows transparency. The endothelial cells therefore function as a kind of fluid control system. They help maintain the balance that keeps the cornea clear. That clarity comes with another unusual feature. The cornea has no blood vessels. Most tissues in the body are threaded with them, bringing oxygen and nutrients directly to where they are needed. The cornea cannot afford that visual clutter. Blood vessels running through it would interfere with transparency, so it remains avascular. Instead, it receives oxygen from the air through the tear film and nutrients from surrounding fluids. This makes the cornea a strange and elegant compromise. It stays alive and active while remaining free of the obvious plumbing most living tissue depends on. Because it is exposed and densely innervated, the cornea is also one of the most sensitive tissues in the body. This is why something tiny in the eye can feel so enormous. A grain of dust, an eyelash, a small scratch, all can produce immediate discomfort, tearing, light sensitivity, and the irresistible feeling that the universe has temporarily shrunk to one irritated eyeball. That sensitivity is protective. If the cornea were not so richly supplied with nerve endings, injuries might go unnoticed and become more serious. Pain, in this case, is a stern but useful message. Something is wrong at the front door. Please stop rubbing it and pay attention. The corneal reflex is part of this protective system. When the cornea is touched, even lightly, the eyelids close automatically. This blink response helps shield the eye from harm. It is one of many small reflexes that keep the front of the eye safe without requiring conscious decision-making. The eyes do not wait for a committee meeting when something approaches too fast. They shut first and let you sort out your feelings afterward. The relationship between the cornea and the tear film is especially close. The tears protect the cornea, and the corneal nerves help stimulate tear production and blinking. When the surface is irritated, tearing often increases. When blinking spreads the tear film, the cornea gets the smooth coating it needs. When the tear film is unstable, the cornea loses part of its optical polish. It is not really useful to think of them separately in everyday function. They work together as the eye's first point of contact with the world. This becomes very obvious in dry environments. Air conditioning, wind, low humidity, long flights, late nights, screen use, and certain medications can all reduce tear stability or production. The eye then begins to feel gritty, tired, burning, or oddly watery. That last part seems unfair but makes biological sense. Irritation can trigger reflex tearing, producing a sudden flood of tears that do not necessarily solve the underlying problem, because they may lack the proper balance needed for a stable film. So a dry eye can sometimes water excessively, which feels like being mocked by your own anatomy. Contact lenses add another layer to the story. A contact lens rests over the cornea and becomes part of the optical system. When it fits well and the tear film remains healthy, this arrangement can work beautifully. But contact lenses also alter the environment at the front of the eye. They can affect oxygen delivery, interact with the tear film, and increase the risk of irritation or infection if not handled properly. Since the cornea has no blood vessels and depends partly on atmospheric oxygen, anything that reduces oxygen access too much can stress the tissue. Modern lenses are designed with this in mind, but the biological reality remains. The cornea is clear and capable, yet it asks for decent treatment. Infection at the corneal surface can be particularly serious because clarity is everything here. If the cornea becomes inflamed or scarred, vision can be affected directly. A minor skin scar on the arm may be mostly a cosmetic matter. A scar in the cornea can alter the path of light itself. This is why protecting the cornea from injury, infection, and excessive dryness matters so much. The front door of the eye is not just a shield, it is part of the optical path, and any disruption at that entry point has consequences for everything downstream. There is also something quietly impressive about how the cornea balances toughness and delicacy. It must stand up to the environment. Dust, wind, accidental rubbing, the daily opening and closing of eyelids, changes in temperature and air quality, all of that passes across it. Yet it must remain smooth, curved, moist, and transparent enough to handle light with great precision. It is like a front gate that must be both a security guard and a glass artist. which is asking quite a lot from any tissue. Its curvature is especially important because the bending of light begins immediately. The world outside sends in light rays that are travelling in many directions. The cornea begins gathering and redirecting those rays toward a more useful path. Without this first major refractive surface, the rest of the eye would have far less chance of producing a sharp image. The lens can fine-tune later, but the cornea sets the stage. This is why procedures that reshape the cornea, such as laser refractive surgery, can so dramatically alter vision. They are not changing the retina or the brain. They're adjusting the first major point where light is bent. Even so, the cornea does not work alone. The tear film above it and the aqueous humour behind it both help create the conditions in which it can function. The eyelids protect it and refresh its surface. The nerves monitor it. The glands feed the tear system. The cornea may be the clear front structure people hear about most often, but it is supported by a whole cast of quiet assistants. Once again, vision turns out to be less a solo performance and more a carefully coordinated group project. One of the most striking things about the cornea is that it remains almost invisible when healthy. You do not look at someone and notice their cornea as a separate object. You see through it, not at it. That is a mark of how well it does its job. In ordinary life, the best functioning parts of the visual system are often the ones you never think about. The cornea earns that invisibility. It stands at the front, exposed to the world, taking the first physical contact with incoming light, and manages to remain almost completely absent from awareness unless something disrupts it. And yet every clear view you have depends on it. Every face recognized, every line of text read, every distant tree outlined against the sky, every quiet glance around a room begins here with the light crossing the tear film and entering the cornea. Before the pupil can narrow, before the lens can adjust, before the retina can detect, this front surface has already had its say. It has smoothed, protected, and bent the incoming light. It has given the rest of the eye a cleaner, more organised beginning. That beginning is easy to overlook because it is so constant. You wake, open your eyes, and light is already arriving. The tears are already coating the surface. The cornea is already performing its refractive work. The eyelids are already spreading a new film with each blink. There is no dramatic announcement, no trumpet fanfare from the front of the eye declaring that the day's optical operations are now underway. It simply starts quietly and efficiently, as it has every day for years. So when people talk about the eye as if vision begins somewhere deeper, perhaps at the pupil or the lens or the retina, it is worth remembering how much has already happened before light even gets that far. The world first meets the eye at this clear entrance, where moisture, curvature, order, and sensitivity all combine. The tear film prepares the surface. The cornea bends the light. The first contact is made. And once that light has crossed this smooth front boundary, it moves toward the darker opening at the centre, where the eye must decide how much of the outside world to admit and how brightly it is prepared to receive it. Once light has crossed the smooth tear film and the curved surface of the cornea, it enters the front chamber of the eye and moves toward one of the most familiar features in the human face, though most people know it more by appearance than by function. This is the coloured ring at the centre of the eye, the iris, with the dark pupil sitting in its middle like a small doorway. They're easy to recognise in a mirror, and easy to overlook in terms of what they actually do. Yet this part of the eye is performing one of the most important early decisions in all of vision. It is deciding how much light to let in. That decision has to be made constantly. The world is not lit evenly. A face can turn towards sunlight and then back into shade. A person can step from a bright street into a dim hallway, glance at a lamp, look down at a page, then up again toward a window. The intensity of light hitting the eye changes from moment to moment, sometimes gently, sometimes abruptly. If the eye admitted the same amount of light all the time, vision would often be poor and sometimes overwhelming. Too much light would wash out detail and create glare. too little would leave the retina short of the information it needs, so the eye does not simply receive light with passive obedience, it regulates access. The iris and pupil are the part of the system that make that regulation possible. The iris is the coloured structure people notice first. Brown, blue, green, hazel, grey, and all the subtle shades in between. The iris gives the eye much of its visible character. It can seem decorative because colour is what stands out, but the colour is not its main job. The iris is a muscular ring made of tissue that controls the size of the pupil. The pupil, despite how it appears, is not a black object sitting in the middle of the eye. It is an opening. It looks black because when light enters it, much of that light is absorbed inside the eye rather than reflected back out toward whoever is looking. In other words, the pupil looks dark for the same reason a deep cave mouth looks dark from a distance. It is an opening into somewhere light does not easily return from. The iris surrounds that opening and changes its size using two sets of muscles. One set tightens the pupil, making it smaller. The other pulls it wider, making it larger. This arrangement allows the eye to adjust continuously to different lighting conditions. In bright light, the pupil constricts. In darkness, it dilates. This sounds simple enough, but its importance becomes clearer when you think about what the retina at the back of the eye is dealing with. The retina must respond to light over a huge range of conditions, from dim evening streets to bright midday sky. The pupil does not solve that challenge by itself, because the retina also adapts, but it helps manage the incoming flood before that light reaches the deeper structures. A useful comparison is the aperture of a camera. A wider aperture lets in more light. A narrower one lets in less. The pupil behaves in a similar way. But the human version is not just mechanical. It is alive, automatic, and tightly connected to the nervous system. You do not have to decide when to shrink your pupils any more than you have to negotiate with your heart about when to beat. The body detects the lighting conditions and acts. When bright light hits the retina, signals travel into the brain and then back out to the iris, causing the pupil to become smaller. This is called the pupillary light reflex. It is fast, useful, and so routine that most people never think about it, unless they notice their pupils changing in a mirror or have a doctor shine a light into their eyes during an examination. That examination is not done for dramatic effect. The pupil's response tells clinicians something about how parts of the visual and nervous systems are functioning. When light is shone into one eye, both pupils normally constrict. That shared response happens because of the way the neural pathways are organized. It means the system is not behaving as two isolated eyes with two isolated reflexes. There is coordination from the start. One eye receives the light, but both pupils respond. Even here, the body is showing that visual function is a cooperative act. The muscles involved in pupil control have their own roles and loyalties within the autonomic nervous system. The sphincter pupillae, the circular muscle that constricts the pupil, is controlled mainly by the parasympathetic system, the branch often associated with quieter bodily states such as rest and maintenance. The dilator pupillae, the muscle that opens the pupil wider, is linked mainly to the sympathetic system, the branch associated with arousal, alertness, and the body's readiness to respond. This means pupil size is not only about light. It can also change with emotion, attention, stress, pain, and certain drugs. Fear can enlarge the pupils. Interest can enlarge them. Some medications shrink them, others widen them. So while the pupil is often described as a light meter, it is also quietly responding to the broader state of the person attached to it. This is one reason the eyes seem expressive in a way that is hard to pin down. A great deal of communication in human interaction comes from the area around the eyes, and pupil size plays a part in that, even when people are not consciously aware of it. Large pupils can subtly signal interest or arousal. Very small pupils can appear tense or narrowed. None of this should be treated like magical mind reading, but it does reflect something real. The pupil is part of the body's internal conversation, and the face sometimes reveals those changes before a person has said a word. Even so, brightness control remains its central optical task, and it does that task with more subtlety than people often imagine. Many assume that the pupil is mainly there to handle extremes, like glaring sunlight or darkness. It does help in those moments, certainly, but it is adjusting all the time. Walk from one room to another and it changes. Look toward a bright window and then away from it and it changes again. Watch a screen in a dark room, then switch on a lamp, and the pupils shift to match the new conditions. These changes are usually small enough not to attract attention, but they matter because the quality of vision depends on the amount of light entering the eye. Brightness is not simply about comfort. It affects sharpness, contrast, and depth of field. A smaller pupil can improve optical quality in certain situations because it reduces some of the blur caused by imperfections in the eye's focusing system. This is part of why bright conditions often feel visually crisp. When the pupil is smaller, less peripheral light enters through the lens, and that can reduce distortions. There is a trade-off, of course. A smaller pupil also means less light overall, which is fine in daylight but not ideal in darkness. In low light, the pupil widens to gather more information, but the wider opening can slightly reduce sharpness and increase the effect of optical imperfections. The eye is always balancing these competing demands. More light can help in dim conditions, but perfect image quality is harder to maintain when the entrance is wide open. This balance also affects how much of the visual world appears in focus at once. A smaller pupil increases depth of field, meaning a larger range of distances may appear reasonably clear. A larger pupil decreases depth of field, which can make focus more selective. Photographers know this well, but the eye lives it continuously. In bright light, the smaller pupil gives the visual system a little extra help. In dim light, the priority shifts toward gathering enough light to function at all. The result is that nighttime vision often feels less sharp, less colourful, and less detailed. The pupil is not the only reason for that, since the retina's rods and cones also play a major role, but pupil size is part of the story. The iris itself is a remarkable piece of anatomy when you look past the obvious colour. Its front surface has patterns, ridges, crypts, and delicate textures that are unique enough to be used in biometric identification systems. No two irises are exactly the same. This makes the iris both a functional structure and a marker of individuality. Yet the patterns that make it visually distinctive are secondary to the fact that it is a muscular ring constantly at work. It sits just behind the cornea and in front of the lens, dividing parts of the front of the eye and helping control the passage of light with quiet discipline. Its colour comes largely from the amount and distribution of pigment, especially melanin. Brown irises contain more melanin, blue irises contain less, and their colour arises partly from the way light scatters in the tissue, somewhat like the sky appearing blue. Green and hazel reflect intermediate patterns of pigment and scattering. These differences can be striking socially and aesthetically, but they do not change the basic task of the iris. Whatever its shade, it is there to manage the pupil. That management becomes especially important in bright environments. Think of being outside on a clear day after stepping from indoors. At first, the brightness can feel almost aggressive. Within moments, the pupils constrict, reducing the incoming light. This is not the whole process of light adaptation, but it is the first visible sign that the eye is responding. The retina and the neural visual system also begin adjusting their sensitivity, but the pupil provides an immediate front-end response. It acts like a first filter, making the problem more manageable before deeper adaptation finishes its work. In darkness, the reverse occurs, though more slowly. Step into a dim room after bright sun, and at first, very little seems clear. The pupils widen, letting in more light, but full dark adaptation takes longer because the retina needs time to adjust its chemistry and sensitivity. This is a useful reminder that the pupil is not a complete solution to changing light. It is one tool among several. People sometimes imagine that because the pupil gets larger in darkness, that should be enough. But the visual system needs deeper adaptation than that. The pupil can only widen so much. the retina still has to change how it responds to the reduced light. This layered system is sensible. Relying on pupil size alone would be far too limited. A pupil can vary only within a modest range, while the brightness conditions humans encounter vary enormously. So the pupil helps, but the retina and brain do much of the heavy work of adaptation. The iris is the doorman, not the entire staff. There is also the matter of protection. Bright light is not merely visually inconvenient. Too much intense light can harm the retina. The pupil's constriction helps limit exposure, especially in ordinary conditions. It is not strong enough to defend against staring at something truly dangerous like the sun, which remains a terrible idea however calm the rest of this narration may be, but it does reduce the general burden of brightness. In that sense, the iris is acting partly as a safety device, as well as an optical regulator. People become especially aware of this when the system is overwhelmed or when sensitivity is heightened. Photophobia, or light sensitivity, can make normal brightness feel excessive. This can happen with migraines, inflammation, corneal injury, dilation from medications or other conditions. In such cases, the usual balance between incoming light and comfort is disturbed. The eye may still be measuring brightness, but the person experiences that brightness as harsh or painful. Again, this shows that seeing is not just about the physics of light. It is also about how living tissue and the nervous system respond to it. The pupil is also involved in something called the near response. When you shift your gaze from a distant object to something close, several things happen together. The eyes converge, turning inward slightly so both are directed toward the near target. The lens changes shape to increase focusing power, and the pupils constrict. This combination helps improve near vision. The smaller pupil increases depth of field and reduces some optical blur, making it easier to see close objects clearly. So the pupil is not only reacting to brightness, it is also helping the eye refine vision based on distance. This becomes especially relevant as we move from the iris toward the lens, because the next part of the story is all about focusing near and far. For now, though, it is worth appreciating how much the pupil is doing before the lens even gets involved. It is deciding how much of the outside world to admit. Not in an emotional sense, of course, though the phrase is tempting, but in a literal optical one. The pupil widens and narrows in response to changing conditions, constantly trying to give the rest of the visual system a manageable amount of light. Too much and details are lost in glare. Too little and the signal weakens. The iris keeps adjusting that opening to suit the moment. That adjustment can also change with age. In general, pupils tend to become somewhat smaller and less responsive in older adults. This means less light may reach the retina under comparable conditions, which can contribute to the feeling that dim environments become harder to see in with age. It is not only the lens and retina that change over time, the pupil's range and speed shift too. What felt comfortably lit in youth may feel frustratingly dim later on, and the reason is partly anatomical, not a moral failure of the lamps. Drugs and medications can change pupil size dramatically as well. Certain eye drops used in examinations are designed to dilate the pupils so the doctor can look more easily at the retina. Other drugs may constrict them. These changes can affect comfort and visual quality. A dilated pupil allows much more light in and reduces the eye's natural ability to narrow the aperture in bright settings, which is why people often feel dazzled and blurred after such an exam. The eye has temporarily lost part of its ordinary light control system. It is like removing the curtains from a room just before noon, and then acting surprised that everyone starts squinting. Sometimes the pupils are not perfectly equal in size. A small difference can be normal in some people, a harmless variation called physiologic anisocoria, but larger or newly developed differences can signal problems involving the iris, nerves, brain, or medications. Doctors pay attention to this because the pupil offers a visible clue to internal function. It is one of the few parts of the nervous system that can be watched adjusting in real time just by looking into someone's eyes. That visible quality has long fascinated humans. People have always noticed the centre of the eye. It draws attention socially, emotionally, artistically. Yet beneath that cultural fascination is a straightforward biological truth. The iris and pupil are part of the machinery that make vision possible. Their beauty is real, but it sits on top of the job. The iris is not coloured for admiration alone. It is built to regulate a dark central opening through which light must pass in the right quantity. And the quantity matters because the eye is dealing with light that is both helpful and potentially troublesome. Without enough light, the world fades. With too much, detail and comfort are lost. The pupil must therefore be flexible. It cannot afford rigidity. The world changes too often for that. Morning light is different from lamplight. Lamplight is different from moonlight. A cloudy day is different from bright snow, candlelight, screens, headlights, and supermarket aisles, with all the subtle charm of an over-enthusiastic refrigerator. The iris handles all of this in silence, continually resizing the entrance. There is something quietly elegant in that. At the centre of each eye is a living opening whose width shifts with the environment, your emotional state, your attention, and your point of focus. It is not just a hole, it is an adjustable threshold. Every scene you see passes through it. Every face, page, doorway, tree, and ceiling lamp enters through an opening whose size is being revised from moment to moment according to conditions your body is monitoring automatically. So by the time light has crossed the tear film and cornea and arrived at the pupil, the eye is already doing more than simply receiving the world. It is selecting an amount, it is measuring brightness, and deciding what level of admission will best support the structures behind it. The iris makes that decision through muscle and reflex, through signals from the nervous system, through a constant balancing act between light gathering and image quality. All of this happens before the image has been fine-tuned for distance, because once light has passed through this adjustable opening, it reaches the transparent structure just behind it, where the task shifts from measuring brightness to shaping focus, and where the lens begins its careful work of bringing the near and the far into view. Now that light has crossed the tear film, passed through the cornea, and slipped through the pupil with the iris deciding how much brightness the eye can comfortably manage, it arrives at one of the most famous structures in the visual system, though perhaps not the most properly appreciated. This is the lens, the clear, flexible structure sitting just behind the iris, quietly changing shape throughout the day so that you can look at something far away, then something close, and have both make sense without needing to stop and think about the physics each time. It is one of those pieces of anatomy that people hear about early in life, and then mostly reduce to a single vague idea. The lens helps you focus. That is true, but it leaves out almost everything interesting. The lens is not simply a bit of transparent material sitting there like a spare glass button. It is living tissue, highly organised, suspended in place with delicate support, constantly adjusting its shape in response to what you are trying to see. That last part is what makes it so special. The cornea at the front of the eye provides most of the eye's focusing power, but its shape is largely fixed. The lens is different. It is the part of the system that can actively fine-tune focus. Without it, your visual world would be far less flexible. You might still manage distant objects depending on the overall shape of the eye, but shifting clearly between a mountain on the horizon and a line of text in your hand would be far more difficult. The lens gives the eye adaptability. It allows the visual system to cope with a world full of different distances, where the next important thing might be across the room or balanced at the end of your nose. To understand why that matters, it helps to think again about what focus actually means. Light reflected from the outside world enters the eye in patterns. Those light rays need to be bent in such a way that they come together properly at the retina, the light-sensitive tissue lining the back of the eye. If they meet in the right place, the image is sharp. If they would come together too early or too late, the image is blurred by the time it reaches the retina. The cornea begins the bending. The lens refines it. Together, they try to make sure that what reaches the retina is not a vague flood of brightness, but an organised image. This becomes especially important when dealing with objects at different distances. Light from something far away arrives at the eye in a different way than light from something nearby. Parallel rays from distant objects require less additional bending than the more divergent rays coming from things close to the face. So when you shift your gaze from the far horizon to a book in your hands, the optical problem changes. The eye has to increase its focusing power to bring the close object into clear view. That increase comes mainly from the lens changing shape. This process is called accommodation, and it is one of the most elegant pieces of quiet mechanics in the body. When you look at something distant, the lens becomes relatively flatter. When you look at something near, the lens becomes more rounded. The more rounded shape increases its refractive power, meaning it bends light more strongly. That extra bending helps focus the image of near objects onto the retina. Then when you look up again at something farther away, the lens flattens once more. It is a constant adjustment happening beneath awareness, and when it works well, most people never think about it. They simply move through the world assuming clarity is normal. The lens does not change shape by itself like a tiny clever creature making independent choices. It is suspended by fine fibres called zonulus, or suspensory ligaments, which connect it to a ring of tissue called the ciliary body. The ciliary body contains the ciliary muscle, and that muscle is what drives accommodation. When the ciliary muscle contracts, it changes the tension on the zonules. With less outward tension pulling on it, the lens is able to become rounder because of its own natural elasticity. When the ciliary muscle relaxes, tension on the zonules increases and the lens is pulled into a flatter shape again. So the system is not based on the lens being actively squeezed into roundness. Rather, it depends on adjusting the pull around it and allowing its form to shift accordingly. This is one of those cases where the body is mechanically more subtle than people often expect. It is not a simple push-button arrangement. It is a tension system. The ciliary muscle, the zonules, and the lens all work together. If any part of that relationship is disrupted, focusing suffers. But when the system is healthy, this shift between near and far feels effortless. You can glance from a face across the room to a message on your phone and barely register that anything physical had to happen inside your eye at all. The fact that it feels effortless should not hide how demanding the job really is. Human vision involves constant distance changes. Reading, walking, driving, cooking, using tools, looking at screens, checking mirrors, watching someone move toward you, glancing down at a cup and back up to a conversation partner. All of this places demands on accommodation. The lens is repeatedly adjusting throughout daily life, doing its work in fractions of a second, never asking for thanks, though perhaps by middle age it begins to feel it has earned some. The lens itself is beautifully unusual as a structure. It is transparent, layered, and avascular, meaning it has no blood vessels. Like the cornea, it cannot allow obvious vascular clutter if it is to remain clear. Light must pass through it cleanly, so the lens receives nourishment from the surrounding fluids rather than through its own internal blood supply. It is enclosed in a capsule and made of elongated cells called lens fibres. These fibres are packed in a highly ordered way that helps maintain transparency. New fibres continue to be added throughout life, and older fibres remain compressed toward the centre. This ongoing growth is one reason the lens changes with age. Its transparency depends on this precise internal order and on careful control of its protein and water content. The lens is filled with specialized proteins called crystallins, which help it remain clear and refract light properly. As long as these proteins stay well organized and the lens remains structurally stable, light can pass through effectively. But the lens lives in a difficult position. It has to remain clear for decades while sitting in a living body, exposed to metabolic changes, oxidative stress, aging, and constant use. It is perhaps not surprising that over time it sometimes begins to lose that remarkable clarity. Before getting to aging though, It is worth staying with the youthful lens a little longer, because its flexibility is one of the quiet marvels of the visual system. In children and young adults, the lens can change shape very effectively. That is why young people can usually focus on very near objects with ease. A child can hold something close to the face and still see it clearly in a way that many older adults would regard with a mixture of admiration and mild resentment. The youthful lens is soft and elastic. It can become more rounded when needed, and then relax again with little trouble. This elasticity is crucial for near vision. Reading, sewing, examining a splinter, looking at a keyhole, checking fine print on a medicine bottle, all of these rely on the eye's ability to increase focusing power. The lens makes this possible. Without accommodation, close work becomes difficult or impossible unless outside optical help is provided. Near focus is not just a convenience, it is central to many human tasks, especially in modern life where reading and screen use occupy so much time. The near response involves more than just the lens. When you look at something close, the eyes also converge slightly, so that both are directed at the target and the pupils constrict, helping improve depth of field and sharpness. But the lens remains the star of this particular part of the process, because it is the structure actually changing optical power. It is the eye's internal focusing element, adjusting itself to the demands of distance. This makes it different from a fixed glass lens in a simple device. A camera can swap lenses or shift them relative to the sensor, but the human eye carries its focusing mechanism inside a living organ, powered by muscle and supported by tissue that must remain transparent and properly aligned. The lens is not just sitting there. It is responsive. It is part of an active system. Of course, any system that depends on flexibility will eventually reveal what happens when flexibility begins to fade. One of the most universal changes in the eye is presbyopia, the gradual loss of near-focusing ability that comes with age. Almost everyone who lives long enough experiences it. Usually it becomes noticeable in the 40s or 50s, though the exact timing varies. People begin to notice that small print is harder to read at a comfortable distance. They hold menus farther away. They seek brighter light. They remove distance glasses to read or begin using reading glasses for the first time. There is often a brief stage of disbelief, followed by a quiet realization that the arms have not grown too short. The lighting has not become globally worse, and the restaurant has not launched a secret campaign against legible typography. The lens has changed. Presbyopia happens mainly because the lens becomes stiffer with age. It is still there, still transparent enough perhaps, still shaped like a lens, but it no longer changes form as easily. Its internal fibres become less elastic and its ability to round up for near focus declines. The ciliary muscle may still be working, the tension system may still be trying, but the lens itself is less willing to cooperate. It is no longer the soft responsive structure it once was. So near vision becomes more effortful and eventually requires optical assistance. This is not the same as nearsightedness or farsightedness, though those can coexist with it. Those conditions relate more to the overall focusing arrangement of the eye at baseline. Presbyopia is specifically the age-related decline in accommodation. It is a near-focusing problem caused by a stiffer lens. It is normal in the sense of being common and expected, but that does not make it any less inconvenient when one is trying to read the ingredients on a jar while standing in a supermarket aisle pretending not to mind. The lens can also develop a more dramatic loss of clarity over time. This is cataract, one of the most common eye conditions in aging populations. A cataract is a clouding of the lens. Instead of remaining transparent, the lens gradually becomes opaque or partially opaque. This interferes with the passage of light. Vision may become blurry, dim, washed out, or more sensitive to glare. Night driving can become difficult because bright lights scatter more. Colours may seem duller. Contrast may fall away. The person may feel as though the world has acquired a permanent thin fog, except that wiping the glasses changes nothing because the problem is deeper inside. Cataracts happen because the proteins and structure inside the lens change with age and other influences such as diabetes, smoking, certain medications, injury or radiation exposure. The once orderly internal arrangement becomes less orderly. Light scatters instead of passing through cleanly. The lens, so long a clear pathway, begins to interfere with the very thing it once served so well. What is striking about cataracts is that they do not involve the eye forgetting how to see in a neural sense. The retina may still function, the optic nerve may still conduct, the brain may still interpret. But if the lens becomes cloudy, the light is compromised before it even reaches those deeper stages properly. This is another reminder that vision depends on every part of the optical chain doing its work. A problem with clarity in the lens affects everything downstream. Even before a cataract becomes clinically significant, the lens naturally yellows somewhat with age. This changes the way some wavelengths of light are transmitted. It can subtly affect colour perception and brightness, though most people do not notice the gradual change because the brain adapts. Only when the clouding or yellowing becomes more pronounced does it start to feel like the visual world has shifted. The lens can also be affected by injury or displacement. Because it is suspended by zonules, trauma or disease affecting those support fibres can cause the lens to shift out of place. When that happens, focus can be severely disrupted. This does not occur in ordinary life for most people, but it shows how dependent the lens is on alignment. It is not enough for the lens to exist. It must be centered, stable, clear, and able to change shape as needed. Vision demands a good deal of this humble structure. For all that, the lens spends most of life being unnoticed. People admire eye colour, notice pupil size, complain about dryness, and sometimes remember the retina from school biology, but the lens works mostly in silence. It is the quiet adjuster. It lives behind the visible front structures and before the more famous neural tissues at the back, making constant fine corrections so that the visual world stays usable. There is something deeply practical about it. It does not create drama unless it has been pushed too far by time or disease. Instead, it makes ordinary acts possible. Reading a sign, threading a needle, seeing a friend's expression across a table, glancing from a dashboard to the road, all of these depend on the lens being capable of the right shape at the right moment, and yet it is not working alone. The ciliary body surrounding it, the aqueous humour in front of it, the vitreous behind it, the iris just ahead of it, all of these provide the environment in which it functions. The lens belongs to a larger system, but within that system, it has a distinct role. It is the adjustable element. It is where the eye stops simply admitting light and begins fine-tuning where that light will land. That makes focus feel almost like a quiet agreement between anatomy and attention. You decide what matters, whether a distant tree or a nearby page, and the eye responds by altering itself to suit that intention. The lens changes, the pupils assist, the eyes converge if needed, and the visual world reorganizes around the chosen target. The shift feels immediate because the body is so practiced at it. But underneath that easy experience is a living optical structure repeatedly changing form. So when you look from the far side of a room down to your hand, or from the moon to a book, or from a person's face to the button they are holding up for you to examine, there is a clear structure behind your iris reshaping itself to make that possible. It is not perfect forever. It stiffens, clouds, ages, and sometimes demands outside help. But for many years it performs one of the most useful acts in ordinary human life. It brings the world near and far into focus by changing itself just enough, over and over again, to keep light falling where it should. And once the light has passed through that shifting lens, now properly directed and refined for the distance at hand, it enters the large transparent space behind it, crossing a quieter interior that seems at first like empty filling, but is actually essential to keeping the eye open, shaped, and optically clear on the way toward the retina at the back. Once light has passed through the cornea, the pupil and the lens, it has already been shaped, narrowed, measured and focused. The front of the eye has done a remarkable amount of work before the light even reaches the back, and yet there is still distance to travel. Between the lens and the retina lies a large inner space that, at first thought, can seem almost uneventful. It does not have the visible colour of the iris or the active shape-changing reputation of the lens. It sounds more like filler than function. This is the vitreous humour, the clear substance filling the main chamber of the eye, and it occupies most of the eye's interior volume. It is quiet, transparent, and easy to ignore, but it plays an important part in keeping the whole structure open, stable, and ready for vision. The word humour in this context is an old anatomical term for fluid, though the vitreous is not exactly a simple liquid. It is more accurate to think of it as a transparent gel. It fills the large cavity behind the lens and in front of the retina, helping the eye keep its rounded shape. Without something occupying that space, the eye would not maintain the form needed for its optical system to work properly. The cornea and lens may bend light, but the eye as a whole must also remain physically structured so that those relationships stay in place. The vitreous helps provide that structural support from within. It is called vitreous because it has a glass-like clarity. That clarity matters enormously. Light has already been carefully directed through the front of the eye, and it must now cross this chamber without being scattered or blocked. The vitreous therefore has to be present but optically unobtrusive. It must fill space while staying out of the way. That is a peculiar assignment for living tissue. Many parts of the body can do their work while being thick, opaque, and visibly busy. The vitreous has to do its work by being almost invisible. Despite its size, it is made mostly of water. More than 98% of it is water, which can make it sound trivial at first, as though the eye were simply padded out with a bit of internal moisture. But the remaining fraction is what gives the vitreous its gel-like nature. Tiny amounts of collagen and substances such as hyaluronic acid create a delicate framework that holds the water in a particular structure. So the vitreous is not a sack of loose fluid sloshing around behind the lens. It is a stabilized gel, mostly transparent, with just enough organization to give it form and function. That form matters because the eye is not only an optical device, it is also a physical globe that needs internal support. The vitreous presses gently outward, helping the retina stay in contact with the underlying structures and helping the eye keep its shape. The pressure within the eye is influenced by several factors, and the aqueous humour at the front plays a different role in maintaining intraocular pressure, but the vitreous contributes to the eye's internal architecture in a quieter, more spacious way. It occupies the deep chamber and helps keep everything where it belongs. This is one reason the vitreous is sometimes compared to the filling of a ball or the padding of a structure, but even that comparison does not fully capture its relationship to vision. It is not merely there to prevent collapse, it also creates a clear path for light between the lens and the retina. If that path were clouded, disorganized, or filled with opaque material, the carefully focused image would not reach the retina cleanly. So the vitreous must be structurally present while remaining optically unobtrusive. It is a chamber that supports by not interfering. That understated role makes it one of the easiest parts of the eye to forget, especially when it is healthy. Most people never think about the vitreous unless age or disease makes them aware of it. In youth, it tends to remain smoothly transparent and relatively stable. It does not call attention to itself. But like the lens, the vitreous changes with time, and those changes reveal just how much it has been doing in silence. Before getting to those changes, it helps to picture where the vitreous sits and how it relates to surrounding structures. At the front, it lies just behind the lens. At the back, it is in contact with the retina, though not equally firmly at every point. In some places, the vitreous is more strongly attached, particularly around the optic disc, the macula, the retinal vessels, and the far peripheral retina. These areas matter because when the vitreous changes with age and begins to pull away, those attachment points can become sites of traction. That sounds technical, but the basic idea is straightforward. A clear gel filling the eye is not just floating without relationships. It has areas of connection, and those connections matter when the gel changes. In early life, the vitreous is fairly uniform and firmly gel-like. It helps the eye maintain a stable inner environment, and gives the retina gentle support from the front. Over time, however, the vitreous gradually becomes less uniform. Parts of it begin to liquefy, a process called vitreous syneresis. The gel becomes more watery in places, and the delicate collagen framework can begin to clump. These clumps are one of the main reasons people start noticing floaters. Floaters are among the most common ways the vitreous introduces itself to consciousness. They often appear as drifting specks, threads, cobwebs, or faint shapes that move across the visual field, especially when looking at a bright plain background such as the sky, a white wall, or a computer screen. They are not usually objects on the surface of the eye or things floating in the air in front of you. They are shadows cast on the retina by changes within the vitreous itself, tiny condensations in the gel block or scatter light, and because they sit inside the eye, their shadows move as the eye moves. What makes floaters so odd is that they often seem to dart away when you try to look directly at them. That happens because they are inside the eye and move slightly with the motion of the vitreous when the eye shifts. So the more you try to pin them down, the more they drift, as though they have been informed of your intentions in advance. This can be mildly irritating, but in many cases floaters are harmless signs of age-related vitreous change. They are reminders that the clear chamber behind the lens is not perfectly still or eternal. It is a living, changing internal space. The more dramatic age-related event involving the vitreous is posterior vitreous detachment. This occurs when the vitreous, having become more liquefied and less uniformly gel-like, begins to separate from the retina at the back of the eye. In many older adults, this happens naturally at some point and may not cause serious trouble, but it can bring symptoms that are quite noticeable, particularly sudden new floaters and flashes of light. The flashes do not come from external light entering the eye. They happen because as the vitreous tugs on the retina during separation, the retina may be mechanically stimulated. Since the retina is a light-detecting neural tissue, stimulation of it can be experienced as flashes, spark-like arcs, or brief flickers, especially in dim conditions. It is a strange reminder that the brain interprets retinal signals as visual events, whether those signals come from light or from physical tugging. The retina does not speak many languages. Stimulate it in the right way, and it reports something luminous. Most posterior vitreous detachments settle without major damage, but they matter because in some cases the pulling can tear the retina. A retinal tear is serious because fluid can then move underneath the retina and lead to retinal detachment, a potentially vision-threatening condition. That is why sudden showers of floaters, flashing lights, or the sense of a curtain or shadow coming over part of the vision deserve prompt medical attention. The vitreous may usually be quiet, but when it shifts too forcefully at one of its stronger attachment points, the consequences can extend to the retina itself. This relationship between vitreous and retina is a good example of how the eye's anatomy is less made of separate isolated pieces than it first appears. The vitreous is not just empty filler and the retina is not just a wallpaper lining. They interact. The state of one can affect the other. When the vitreous is youthful and stable, that interaction remains almost unnoticed. When the vitreous ages, contracts, liquefies, or pulls, the retina may feel the effects. The clarity of the vitreous also matters in disease. If blood leaks into it, as can happen with certain retinal disorders, diabetes-related eye disease, or trauma, the visual effect can be dramatic. Blood in the vitreous blocks light and creates shadows, sometimes causing sudden dark floaters, haze, or significant loss of vision. Because the vitreous occupies so much of the inner eye, anything that clouds it can interfere broadly with the visual pathway. Light that was meant to pass cleanly through now encounters suspended material. The result can be like trying to see through smoke in a room that's supposed to be empty and clear. Inflammatory cells can also enter the vitreous in certain conditions, reducing clarity. Infection, inflammation, bleeding, or debris all reveal how dependent sight is on the transparency of this chamber. When healthy, the vitreous almost disappears from awareness. When compromised, it can disrupt the entire visual experience because so much of the light's path depends on crossing it undisturbed. There is another interesting contrast worth noticing here between the vitreous humour and the aqueous humour. Both are clear substances in the eye and both are called humours, but they are quite different. The aqueous humour is a clear fluid in the front of the eye, constantly produced and drained, helping nourish tissues like the cornea and lens, and contributing to pressure regulation. The vitreous, by contrast, is a gel-like substance in the back chamber, much larger in volume and far less actively circulated. One is more like a dynamic fluid system. The other is more like a structural transparent filling. Their names sound related because they are, but their jobs are distinct. The vitreous also has a developmental story. During early life and before birth, structures exist within the eye that later regress as the mature visual system takes shape. The vitreous itself changes composition over time, and remnants of developmental pathways may occasionally persist in harmless ways. What matters for ordinary adult vision is that by maturity the vitreous serves as a clear, supportive chamber, with the retina depending on it partly for gentle internal support, and light relying on it for a transparent route. Its transparency is especially impressive because the vitreous has to remain clear for decades in a living body that is not exactly calm or sterile in the grand sense. The eye moves constantly, the body ages, metabolic stress accumulates, yet the vitreous often remains functionally transparent for a very long time. Even when floaters appear, much of it still does its job well enough that people carry on seeing through it without much trouble. That durability deserves some appreciation. The eye asks its internal tissues for a great deal. Remain alive, remain clear, remain organized, and do not get in the way of the light. The vitreous manages this with very little public recognition. There is something almost architectural about it. The lens focuses the incoming image. The retina waits at the back to receive it. In between, the vitreous keeps the chamber open and optically usable. It is less like an active actor in a performance, and more like the stage space that allows the whole scene to happen properly. But of course, stages matter. If the space collapses, clouds, or pulls at the wrong moment, the performance changes immediately. Even the phrase "holds the eye open" is more important than it first sounds. The eye needs to preserve precise spatial relationships. The retina must remain at the back. The lens must remain in front. The distance between optical surfaces matters. Shape matters. Slight alterations in length and curvature already cause familiar focusing problems, like myopia and hyperopia. So the inner volume of the eye is not an accidental cavity. It is part of the optical design. The vitreous helps preserve that design by occupying the space reliably. At the same time, it does not behave like a rigid support beam. It has softness and movement. This is why floaters drift, and why changes in its gel structure can lead to shifting internal shadows. It is stable enough to support but soft enough to move. Again, the eye prefers compromise solutions that meet several needs at once: tough but clear, soft but supportive, present but invisible. The vitreous is another example of the biological balancing act. Some surgical procedures even involve removing the vitreous, partly or completely, in a procedure called vitrectomy. This may be done for retinal problems, severe vitreous hemorrhage, certain complications of diabetes, or other conditions where the vitreous has become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. The fact that surgeons can replace its function to some extent with other materials tells us that its role is structural and optical rather than magical. But it also tells us that when disease affects this chamber, managing it becomes central to restoring or preserving vision. Still, under ordinary circumstances, the vitreous remains one of the calmest regions in the eye. It does not regulate pupil size, It does not change shape like the lens. It does not actively transduce light like the retina. It holds, supports, and clears the way. Those are quieter verbs, but they matter. In the body, quieter jobs are often mistaken for lesser ones. Yet sight depends just as much on the absence of interference as on the presence of active signalling. Think of how much the light has already survived by the time it reaches this chamber. It has come from the world outside, reflected off objects, entered through tears and cornea, passed through aqueous humour, crossed the pupil, and been finally focused by the lens. If it then had to struggle through a cloudy, unstable, cluttered interior before reaching the retina, all that earlier work would be compromised. The vitreous protects that path by giving the light space to travel. That space is not just physical but visual. When you look through the eye, the retina needs a clear image to interpret. The vitreous is part of what allows the image to remain coherent on its way there. It is the still chamber behind the more active front structures, giving the focused rays room to complete their course. There is something satisfying in that arrangement. The eye begins with surfaces that bend and regulate, then opens into a wide, clear interior, and only then reaches the sensory tissue that will begin turning light into nerve signals. The older one gets, the more likely the vitreous is to make itself known through floaters, flashes, or gradual changes, but for many years it remains little more than a silent, transparent space doing its job faithfully. That silence is part of its success. You're not meant to notice it. The perfect vitreous from the standpoint of ordinary vision is one that fills the chamber, holds the shape, supports the retina gently, and never once insists on being the subject of discussion. It is, in a sense, the ideal background worker. And now the journey of light is nearing its real destination within the eye. After crossing this large quiet chamber, the focused image arrives at the back wall of the globe, where the retina waits as a living sheet of neural tissue ready to detect brightness, contrast, colour and motion. The light has been admitted, measured, refined and carried through clear space. What happens next is where vision stops being mainly optical and begins becoming electrical, because the retina is where light is finally caught and turned into the first language the brain can understand. By the time light reaches the retina, a great deal has already happened. It has reflected from the world outside, crossed the tear film, bent through the cornea, passed through the pupil, been refined by the lens, and travelled through the clear vitreous chamber. The eye has admitted it, measured it, focused it, and carried it carefully toward the back wall of the globe. And then, at last, the light arrives at the place where seeing begins to change, from optics into biology in a more serious sense. The retina is where incoming light is no longer merely guided, it is detected, it is translated, it is turned into signals the nervous system can use. If the front of the eye is about shaping the image, the retina is where that image begins its conversion into something the brain can understand. People sometimes describe the retina as the screen at the back of the eye, and that comparison is helpful as long as it is not taken too literally. A screen in the ordinary sense simply receives an image. The retina does more than that. It is not a blank surface waiting for projection. It is living neural tissue, layered, metabolically active, and already processing information before anything leaves the eye. It is more like a highly specialized outpost of the brain, spread along the inside of the eye, built to catch light and begin making decisions about it immediately. This alone makes it one of the most extraordinary tissues in the body. It is not just seeing, it is computing. The retina lines the inner back portion of the eye, and it must remain in a very precise position for vision to work properly. The incoming light has been focused so that an image falls upon it. If the retina is healthy, and the optical system in front has done its job well, the light reaches this surface in an organized pattern corresponding to the outside world. Bright regions in the scene send more light. Darker regions send less. Colors differ according to wavelength. Edges create contrasts. Movement changes where light lands over time. All of that arrives at the retina, which must then begin making sense of it. The first cells that matter here are the photoreceptors. These are the specialized cells that respond directly to light, and they come in two main types, rods and cones. Both are photoreceptors, meaning both detect light, but they are built for somewhat different jobs. Rods are extremely sensitive to low levels of light. They help us see in dim conditions, especially at night or in shadow. Coneas are less sensitive to low light, but they provide color vision and fine detail in brighter conditions. Between them, these two cell types allow the retina to handle a wide range of visual environments, from twilight streets to midday sunlight, from rough outlines to sharp printed letters. This division of labour explains a great deal about how vision feels in different settings. In bright daylight, the world is rich with detail and colour. Faces are easy to read, printed words are crisp, fine textures stand out. This is the domain in which cones are doing much of the work. In dim light, things change. The world becomes less colourful, less sharp, more dependent on broad shapes and movement. That is because rods take over more of the job. Rods are more sensitive than cones, but they do not provide the same level of fine detail or colour discrimination. The trade-off is sensible. In darkness, detecting that something is there matters more than seeing every perfect line and shade. The rods are especially numerous in the retina. In fact, they vastly outnumber cones. This tells you something important about visual priorities in evolutionary terms. For a long time in natural settings, being able to detect faint light, movement and general form in dim conditions was essential. A human or early mammal who noticed motion in poor light had an advantage over one who needed daylight-level conditions before anything became visible. Rods serve that purpose. They are highly sensitive and excellent for scotopic vision, which is the term for low-light vision. Coneas, though fewer in number, are built for photopic vision, meaning daylight or well-lit vision. They are the cells that let us appreciate colour and fine detail. They come in different classes, each tuned to different ranges of wavelengths of visible light. Very broadly speaking, there are cones most sensitive to longer wavelengths, medium wavelengths, and shorter wavelengths. The brain compares the activity of these different cone types to generate the experience of colour. Colour, then, is not a simple property stamped onto objects in a direct way. It is a constructed experience arising from the relative responses of cone cells to the wavelengths of light reflected from a surface. This is why colour vision can vary between people and why colour blindness exists. If one class of cones is absent, reduced, or working differently, colour discrimination changes. The world does not disappear, but certain distinctions become harder or impossible to make. Most commonly, red-green colour vision differences arise because of altered function in the cones, sensitive to longer or medium wavelengths. Again, this shows that seeing is not simply a neutral recording of the world. It depends on the biological equipment doing the recording, and that equipment varies. The rods and cones are shaped and organised in ways that support their work. Each photoreceptor contains light-sensitive molecules that react when photons strike them. In rods, the key molecule is rhodopsin. In cones, related photopigments respond differently depending on wavelength. When light hits these pigments, it triggers a chemical change, which then sets off a chain of events inside the cell. That chain alters the cell's electrical state. In other words, light energy becomes a biological signal. This is the crucial transformation at the heart of vision. Up until the retina, the problem was mainly optical. At the retina, the problem becomes neural. The world outside is now being translated into the language of the nervous system. That translation is elegant but also slightly counterintuitive. Many people assume that when light hits a photoreceptor, the cell simply turns on like a lamp or a switch. The reality is more subtle. Photoreceptors behave in a somewhat unusual way. In darkness, they are relatively active in one sense, and when light strikes them, that activity changes in a pattern the retina can interpret. The important point for a sleep-friendly explanation is not the exact ionic details, but the fact that the retina is not a basic on-off camera sensor. It is a living tissue with chemistry, gradients, and signal changes already richer than most casual descriptions suggest. Another detail people often find surprising is that light must pass through several layers of retinal tissue before reaching the rods and cones, which sit deeper in the retina than one might expect. On first hearing this, it sounds like a strange design choice, rather as if someone had built the wiring in front of the reception screen. But biology often works with inherited structure rather than tidy engineering from scratch. The retina is layered in a way that reflects its developmental origin as neural tissue. Even so, the system works extraordinarily well, and specialized support cells and precise organization help ensure that light reaches the photoreceptors with usable efficiency. Behind the photoreceptors lies the retinal pigment epithelium, an essential supporting layer that is easy to overlook but deeply important. This pigmented layer helps absorb stray light so that it does not bounce around inside the eye and blur the image. It also nourishes the photoreceptors, helps recycle components of the visual pigments, and participates in cleaning up the constant wear and tear that comes with light detection. Photoreceptors are active cells under ongoing metabolic stress. They need close support. The retinal pigment epithelium provides much of that support and helps keep the retinal environment orderly. Without it, the light-catching machinery would struggle to survive. The relationship between photoreceptors and light is not static. The retina adapts. This is why walking from bright sunlight into a dim room feels so different at first, compared with a few minutes later. The pupil changes size quickly, but the retina also adjusts its sensitivity through chemical and neural adaptation. In bright light, the system reduces sensitivity because there is already plenty of information. In darkness, sensitivity rises over time, especially in rods. This process is why dark adaptation takes a while. The rods gradually recover the chemistry needed to detect faint light well, and as they do, the world slowly reveals itself. Shapes emerge first, then boundaries and movement become easier to detect. But colour remains weak because cones are not functioning strongly in those low-light conditions. This explains one of the little oddities of night vision. Under starlight or in a very dim room, you may notice that things visible out of the corner of your eye are harder to see when looked at directly. That is because the very centre of your retina is not especially rich in rods. The peripheral retina contains many more rods, making it better for detecting dim objects. So if a faint star seems to vanish when you stare straight at it, the eye is not misbehaving. It is revealing how the retina is organized. The center is built for detail in good light. The periphery is better at picking up faint signals. That organization matters enormously. The retina is not a uniform sheet where every area does the same thing equally well. Different regions have different strengths. The central region is especially important for fine detail and color, while more peripheral regions contribute more to motion detection and low-light sensitivity. This division makes sense when you think about how people use vision. For reading, facial recognition, and fine work, you point the eyes directly at the target. For noticing movement around you and keeping track of the broader environment, the peripheral retina helps keep watch. The eye does not distribute its resources evenly. It concentrates them where they are most useful. Still, even within the retina as a whole, rods and cones are only the beginning. Once these cells respond to light, the signal does not simply sprint toward the brain untouched. Instead, it passes through a network of other retinal neurons. Bipolar cells, horizontal cells, amacrine cells, and ganglion cells all participate in the next stages of processing. That may sound like an intimidating list, but the basic idea is simple enough. The retina is already sorting, comparing, and refining the incoming information. It is sensitive to contrast, edges, and change. It is not just measuring raw brightness point by point, it is beginning to analyze patterns. This is one reason vision feels so immediate and effective. By the time signals leave the retina through the ganglion cells, some very useful pre-processing has already occurred. The retina helps emphasize differences in light and dark, detect contours, and encode visual information in ways that the brain can use efficiently. You're not sending a naive, untouched photograph down the optic nerve. You're sending a transformed version of the scene, one already shaped by retinal intelligence. That word intelligence may sound too generous for a thin sheet of tissue, but it makes the point. The retina is not passive. It is neural. It performs real computation. In some ways, it behaves less like a camera sensor and more like an active filter and encoder. That does not make it conscious, of course, but it does mean the eye begins making decisions earlier than people tend to imagine. The rods and cones also differ in how they connect to later retinal neurons. Many rods may converge onto shared pathways, which increases sensitivity in dim light but reduces fine spatial resolution. Cones, particularly in the central retina, often have more precise and less convergent connections, supporting sharper detail. This is another example of the same trade-off seen elsewhere in the visual system. Sensitivity and precision are not always maximized together. The retina balances them depending on location and conditions. Low light demands sensitivity. Fine detail demands selectivity. All of this is happening in tissue that is metabolically very demanding. The retina uses a great deal of energy. Photoreceptors, in particular, are active cells that require constant support. This is one reason retinal blood supply matters so much. The retina needs oxygen and nutrients delivered reliably. Compromise that supply and vision can suffer quickly. This helps explain why diseases involving diabetes, blood vessels, or degeneration can affect sight so profoundly. The hidden screen at the back of the eye is not just a delicate receiving surface. It is a hungry piece of neural tissue with serious maintenance needs. Because it is so demanding, the retina is also vulnerable. Damage to photoreceptors, the retinal pigment epithelium, or the supporting circulation can lead to loss of function that glasses cannot fix. Glasses can redirect light. They cannot replace dead photoreceptors. This is an important distinction. Blurry vision from ordinary focusing problems often comes from optics at the front of the eye. But vision loss from retinal disease comes from disruption of the tissue that actually catches the light and begins turning it into signals. That gives the retina a kind of seriousness different from the front structures. The cornea and lens must be clear. The pupil must regulate brightness. But the retina is where the image becomes alive in neural terms. If the retina cannot respond, no amount of beautiful focusing in front will create sight. The optics are essential, but the retina is indispensable. There is something quietly moving about that idea. The eye carries the world inward through clear structures and careful geometry, and at the very back a living sheet of cells receives that effort and turns it into the first whisper the brain can hear. Light itself is not vision. An image on the retina is not yet vision either, but the retina is the place where the transformation truly begins. It catches the outside world and starts translating it into the inner language of experience. This also helps explain why people can sometimes perceive flashes of light when no actual light is present. Mechanical stimulation of the retina, migraine activity, or other disruptions in visual pathways can produce luminous experiences because what the brain finally knows is retinal or visual neural activity, not the ultimate source of that activity. If the retina signals as though light were there, the brain may report something bright. It is interpreting the language it receives, not checking the external sky for confirmation. Even ordinary vision shows how interpretive the process is. The retina does not merely count photons and hand them off. It responds differently depending on context, adaptation state, and local contrast. A grey patch may look lighter or darker depending on its surroundings. A steady, unchanging image may fade from awareness if fixed in precisely the same position. Motion, edge, and contrast matter enormously because the retina and brain evolved to care about change and structure, not just static pools of light. Once again, sight turns out to be less like copying and more like organized interpretation. The rods and cones are the beginning of that interpretation, and their partnership defines much of what daily seeing feels like. In bright sun, cones dominate and give you color, fine detail, and clarity. At dusk, rods increasingly contribute, preserving the sense of space and movement as colour fades. On a cloudy evening, you may still walk confidently through a room because rods are helping you detect broad forms, even though reading small text becomes awkward. The world has not disappeared. It has simply shifted into a mode of vision in which different retinal tools are at work. That shift is so normal that people rarely pause to admire it. The retina is constantly adjusting between these modes, continually receiving light, recalibrating sensitivity, and dividing labour between rod and cone pathways. Every sunrise, every dim hallway, every cinema, every shadow under a tree, every late-night glance toward a lamp or the moon asks the retina to manage changing conditions. It does so with very little complaint, though when conditions are poor it may fairly point out that you are asking a daylight-centered primate eye to do its best with limited resources. So here at the back of the eye, in the quiet darkness behind the lens and vitreous, the hidden screen is not really hidden at all in functional terms. It is central. It is where the outside world first becomes electrical, and where rods and cones begin their endless task of catching light, dividing duties, and sending forward the first shaped signals of sight. And once that broad retinal sheet has done its work, attention naturally begins to narrow toward the most specialized area within it, the tiny central region where detail becomes sharpest, color becomes richest, and the eye reserves its finest precision for the point you look at most directly. There is a small area inside each eye that does an astonishing amount of work for something so tiny. It sits in the middle of the retina, easy to miss in a diagram if you're not paying attention, and yet much of what people think of as clear vision depends on it. Reading a sentence, recognizing a face, threading a needle, noticing the expression in someone's eyes, checking the time, seeing the edge of a key, spotting a distant sign. All of these rely heavily on a specialized central zone that is built for precision rather than breadth. This region is the macula, and at its very center lies an even smaller structure called the fovea. If the retina as a whole is the hidden screen where light is caught and translated, then the macula is the part reserved for the finest detail, and the fovea is its most demanding and highly trained specialist. This arrangement is one of the clearest examples of how the eye is not designed to see everything equally well. Human vision feels broad. When you open your eyes, it seems as though the whole scene is present in similar detail. A room appears stable. A landscape looks complete. A page seems fully visible all at once, but that impression is slightly misleading. Your visual field is wide, yes, but the sharpest detail lives in a very limited central region. Most of the scene is seen with less precision than you consciously realize. The reason it still feels complete is that your eyes are moving constantly. Your attention shifts rapidly, and the brain stitches together those repeated high-detail glimpses into a stable experience. In other words, sharp vision is concentrated in a tiny place, but perception smooths over that fact so well that most people never notice. The macula is the central area of the retina responsible for detailed central vision. It is not the entire retina, and does not try to be. It is a specialized region where the retinal structure is adapted for fine discrimination. Compared with more peripheral parts of the retina, the macula contains a much higher density of cones. The photoreceptors that support color vision and detailed vision in good light. This alone tells you something about its role. The macula is built for the kind of seeing that matters when you look directly at something. It is not mainly for detecting faint movement in darkness or broad visual awareness. It is for the center of your gaze where accuracy counts. At the very middle of the macula lies the fovea, and this is where the specialization becomes even more extreme. The fovea is tiny, but it is the point of highest visual acuity in the human eye. When you direct your gaze toward a word, a face, or a fine object, you're trying to place its image on the fovea. The eye is constantly moving in ways that make this possible. You do not simply leave your gaze somewhere near the target and hope for the best. The visual and motor systems work together to bring what matters most onto this one small retinal region, where the eye can provide its sharpest and most detailed information. The fovea achieves this sharpness through several anatomical choices. First, it is densely packed with cones, and those cones are arranged more tightly here than anywhere else in the retina. This high density allows for very fine sampling of the visual image. More receptors packed into a small area means more precise information about small differences in light, colour and position. Second, the retinal layers that sit in front of the photoreceptors are displaced to the side in the foveal region. This creates a little pit, which is why the name fovea comes from a word meaning pit. The result is that incoming light has a clearer path to the cones in this area, with less overlying tissue in the way. Third, the neural connections in the fovea are arranged to preserve fine detail. There is less convergence than in more peripheral retina, meaning that signals from individual cones can remain more distinct rather than being pooled together. That last point matters a great deal. Elsewhere in the retina, especially in rod-rich peripheral areas, many photoreceptors may converge onto shared downstream pathways. This boosts sensitivity, which is useful in dim light, but it sacrifices spatial precision. In the fovea, the opposite trade-off is favoured. Sensitivity to extremely faint light matters less than the ability to distinguish tiny details. So the visual system gives the fovea more precise wiring. It is expensive in terms of neural resources, but it is worth it for tasks like reading and face recognition, which are central to human life. This is why the centre of your vision feels so different from the edges, even if you do not normally notice the contrast. Try this in ordinary life and the difference becomes obvious. Look directly at a word on a page. It is clear. Now, without moving your eyes, try to read a word several lines away in your peripheral vision. The letters are there, but the precision drops quickly. Or look directly at one person in a group and notice how much less detailed the others become when they sit away from the centre of gaze. You can still detect them, still understand the general scene, still register motion and position, but the crispness is missing. That is the division of labour in action. The centre specialises in detail. The periphery watches the wider world. This arrangement makes practical sense. Human beings need both detailed central vision and broad peripheral awareness, but they do not need both at maximum strength in every retinal location. That would be wasteful and biologically difficult. Instead, the eye concentrates its most precise resources where direct attention falls. Then it uses eye movements to bring relevant objects into that privileged zone. In effect, the eye does not make the whole retina equally sharp. It makes one part excellent and lets motion and neural processing do the rest. Those eye movements are part of the story of the macula and fovea, whether people realise it or not. Your eyes are making quick movements called saccades all the time, shifting your gaze from one point of interest to another. When you read, your eyes jump across the line in a sequence of brief stops and fast shifts. During each stop, the fovea samples a small piece of text in detail. Then the eyes jump again. You do not experience this as a series of jerky snapshots, because the brain smooths the process into continuous reading. But the fovea is doing the fine work in each pause. Without it, reading would be far slower and far less precise. The same is true for face recognition. Human faces contain subtle information in small arrangements. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth, slight changes in expression, the spacing of features. These are not broad, low-detail signals. They require high acuity. That is why you instinctively look directly at a face you are trying to identify or understand. You are placing it on the fovea. A face in peripheral vision may be recognizable as a face, perhaps even as a familiar person if conditions are good. But the details that make expression and identity clear are best handled by the macula and fovea. Colour vision also reaches its richest form here because cones dominate central vision. The fovea is packed almost entirely with cones and has very few rods. That means it excels in bright light detailed vision, but is not especially good in dim conditions. This helps explain why looking directly at a faint object in low light can sometimes make it harder to see. The rod-rich peripheral retina may detect it better than the cone-heavy centre. The fovea is a daylight specialist. It does not perform its best when illumination is poor. In bright conditions, though, it is the part of the retina that lets the world appear vivid, crisp, and finely textured. The macula as a broader region supports central vision around the fovea and is also essential for many daily tasks. Damage to the macula can leave peripheral vision intact while severely affecting the ability to read, drive, recognize faces, or perform close work. This fact often surprises people because it reveals how much ordinary life depends not on the full width of the visual field, but on this central pocket of high-quality information. Someone can have functioning peripheral vision and still be profoundly limited if central vision is lost. The eye may still detect where things are in a general sense, but the fine visual world becomes hard to access. This is why diseases affecting the macula are so significant. Age-related macular degeneration, for example, damages the central retina and can lead to loss of detailed vision even when side vision remains. People with macular degeneration often describe distortion, blurred central spots, or difficulty reading and recognizing faces. The condition does not usually make the entire world vanish into darkness. Instead, it robs the center of its clarity. That selective loss reveals just how much of daily seeing depends on this one small region. The broad scene may still exist around the edges, but without the macula and fovea, the part of vision most people rely on for fine detail is compromised. There is something almost unfair about how much responsibility is assigned to such a small area. The fovea is tiny, yet it carries the burden of tasks that define literate, socially complex human life. Reading small text, interpreting subtle facial expressions, working with tools, navigating detailed environments, noticing tiny visual cues, all of this falls heavily upon that minute central pit. It is a reminder that biological importance and physical size are not the same thing. A structure can be small and still be absolutely central to how daily life functions. The blood supply around the macula also reflects its importance. The retina as a whole has a demanding metabolic life, but the central retina must maintain extremely fine structure and high performance. The fovea itself is specialized in a way that minimizes the amount of tissue and vasculature lying directly in front of the most detail-sensitive cones. This supports optical clarity, but it also means the supporting environment has to be carefully maintained. Small disruptions in fluid balance, circulation, or retinal architecture in the macular region can have outsized effects on vision. That becomes especially clear in conditions like diabetic macular edema, where fluid accumulates in the macula and disturbs its fine structure. Because detailed central vision depends on such precise anatomy, swelling in this area can reduce acuity and distort the image. Straight lines may appear bent. Fine print becomes difficult. The problem is not necessarily that the whole retina has failed. It is that the central architecture has been disrupted. Sharpness depends on structural precision, and the macula is a place where that precision matters more than almost anywhere else in the eye. The macula also contains pigment, which gives it its name. This pigment helps absorb certain kinds of light and may offer some protective function. It is another reminder that the central retina is not just a random patch where cones happen to be more crowded. It is a deliberately specialized environment with unique structural and functional features. The body has invested resources here because the benefits of high-resolution central vision are immense. One of the more curious consequences of this arrangement is that the visual world feels much richer in detail than the retina can actually provide all at once. If the fovea covers only a small central area, why does the whole room seem sharp? The answer lies partly in eye movements and partly in the brain's talent for building a stable visual model. Your eyes are always sampling different parts of the scene. Each time they land, the fovea gathers detailed information about that particular point. Memory and neural processing then blend these sampled details into an experience that feels broad and coherent. You do not feel as though you are seeing one small high-definition patch at a time. You feel as though the entire world is laid out evenly before you. That feeling is useful, but it is an illusion of completeness built from constant movement and reconstruction. Attention makes this even more interesting. Even within the central visual field, not everything is processed equally at every moment. The macula and fovea can deliver exquisite detail, but the brain still decides what deserves the most emphasis. This is why you can miss something obvious even when it falls near the center of your gaze if your attention is directed elsewhere. High acuity does not guarantee conscious notice. It simply provides the opportunity for detailed information to be available. Still, the importance of the fovea remains. It is the target of direct gaze because it is the place where the eye performs best for detail. That target matters so much that the whole oculomotor system, the muscles and neural circuits controlling eye movement, is effectively in service to getting important images onto it. When something catches your attention, the eyes move to place it on the fovea. When you read, you line up the text with it. When you examine a face, you use it. The fovea is not a passive luxury. It is the center around which much of active looking is organized. This also explains why damage just outside the macula can feel different from damage within it. A peripheral retinal problem may affect side vision, motion awareness, or parts of the field without immediately destroying the ability to read or recognize faces. A foveal problem, by contrast, can make those everyday tasks difficult very quickly. The centrality of central vision becomes obvious only when it is threatened. People often assume that broad visual field is the whole story of seeing, but in ordinary life the sharp center is doing much of the most meaningful work. There is also a subtle difference between seeing clearly and knowing where you are in space. Peripheral vision is excellent for orientation, motion detection, and maintaining awareness of the wider environment. It helps you move through the world without bumping into things and alerts you to changes outside the center of focus. But it does not read small print or appreciate the fine texture of a leaf in the same way. The macula and fovea are the specialists in that kind of precision. Together, these systems create a vision that is both broad and sharp, though not evenly so. In some ways, the macula and fovea are like the difference between a wide audience view of a stage and the small spotlight where the fine action happens. The whole stage matters, movement at the edges matters, the broader arrangement matters. But the details people care about most are often in the spotlight. In human vision, that spotlight is not external. It is built into the retina itself, and the eyes keep moving it around the world. This specialization is not a flaw. It is a very sensible use of biological resources. Building an entire retina with foveal-level detail everywhere would require enormous neural processing and may not even be practical in the size of a human eye and brain. Instead, evolution settled on a mixed strategy. Make one tiny region exceptionally good. Surround it with broader, less detailed support. Add rapid eye movements and intelligent processing. The result is a visual system that feels rich, flexible, and efficient. It does not give uniform detail everywhere, but it gives enough detail where it matters most. And what matters most often changes from moment to moment. A face, a line of text, the edge of a step, a small object on a table, the road sign ahead, the label on a bottle, the thread in a needle, the time on a clock, the look in someone's eyes. The fovea is brought to each of these in turn, doing its concentrated work while the rest of the retina maintains the larger scene around it. It is a beautiful division of labour, one that remains almost invisible because it is so successful. Even the sense of what counts as normal sharp vision depends on it. When people say their vision is blurry, they often mean that the world is not landing properly on the macula, and especially the fovea, whether because of focusing problems, retinal disease, swelling, scarring, or other causes. Sharpness is not an abstract property. It lives in tissue. It depends on cones packed tightly into a tiny central place, supported by careful anatomy and fed by an optical system that has spent the whole journey of light trying to deliver a clean image right there. So while the retina as a whole catches the image, it is this one central region that gives human vision much of its precision and usefulness in daily life. The macula supports detailed central sight, and the fovea sits at the very centre of that task, collecting the most refined information the eye can provide. It is a small piece of tissue with a remarkably large influence over how the visible world feels to you. And yet even here, at the point of finest detail, the information still has farther to go. The photoreceptors and retinal circuits have done their work. The image has been sampled with great precision, but the signals must still leave the eye altogether. They must gather, travel, and pass through the place where the retina gives way to the optic nerve, carrying with them both the detail of the centre and the wider story of the rest of the visual field as they move toward the brain. There is a quiet point inside each eye where the seeing surface ends and the signal begins its journey outward. Light has crossed the eye, reached the retina, been caught by rods and cones, passed through layers of retinal processing, and been sharpened by that tiny central region built for detail. By now, the image is no longer just light at all, it has become a pattern of electrical activity, shaped and organised by living tissue. But that pattern still has to leave the eye. It has to gather itself, pass through a narrow exit, and travel toward the brain, where sight will become something more complete. That exit point is one of the strangest features in the visual system, because it creates a built-in gap, a place where the retina cannot detect light at all. This is the optic disc, where the optic nerve leaves the eye, and it is the anatomical reason every human being has a blind spot. The idea of a blind spot sounds more dramatic than it usually feels in daily life. People often imagine that if the eye has a blind spot, there ought to be a constant black hole floating somewhere in vision, a little void drifting around like an uninvited guest at the centre of every room. But that is not how it feels at all. Most people go through life without noticing their blind spots, unless someone specifically demonstrates them in a vision experiment. The reason is simple and fascinating. The blind spot is real, but the brain is extremely good at hiding it. To understand why the blind spot exists, it helps to picture the retina once again as a sheet of neural tissue lining the inside back of the eye. The rods and cones sit there catching light, converting it into signals, and passing those signals onward through retinal circuits. Eventually the information reaches ganglion cells, whose long fibres gather together and head toward one specific place in the retina. Those fibres do not exit separately like a polite line of individuals leaving a theatre one at a time. They bundle together into a thick cable. That cable becomes the optic nerve. The point where those fibres leave the retina is the optic disc, sometimes called the optic nerve head. It is a real physical exit. The fibres pass through the wall of the eye and continue backward toward the brain. Blood vessels also enter and leave the eye in this region, supplying the retina with the circulation it needs. Because this spot is devoted to nerve fibres and blood vessels, there are no rods or cones there. No photoreceptors means no light detection. Any image falling on that part of the retina goes unseen by that eye. This is the blind spot. It is not a flaw in the sense of something having gone wrong. It is simply the consequence of how the human retina is wired. The visual signal needs an exit path, and the place where that exit happens cannot also serve as a light-detecting surface, so the eye accepts a small missing area in exchange for having a way to send its information onward. It is another of those biological compromises that at first seems odd, then starts to look rather sensible once the larger system is understood. The location of the blind spot is not in the centre of vision. That would be intolerable and would make daily life much more difficult. Instead, it sits off to one side in each eye's visual field because of the way the retina is mapped to the outside world. The blind spot of the right eye lies in one lateral part of its field, and the blind spot of the left eye lies in the opposite lateral part of its field. Since the two eyes look at overlapping scenes from slightly different positions, one eye usually covers the blind spot of the other. That alone helps explain why people do not notice it. The missing information from one eye is often available from the other, but even when using one eye alone, the blind spot often remains unnoticed. This is where the brain's editing work becomes especially impressive. The visual system does not usually present you with a dark blank circle where information is missing. Instead, it fills in the gap using surrounding visual context. If a patterned background continues across the blind spot, the brain tends to extend that pattern. If a plain surface lies there, it appears plain. The visual world feels continuous because the brain prefers continuity when the missing region is small and predictable. It is doing what it often does in vision, building a stable, usable scene from incomplete input. This filling in process is not some rare emergency trick. It is happening constantly. Every waking moment, your brain is managing the fact that each eye has a patch of visual field it cannot directly sample. Yet your conscious experience remains smooth and uninterrupted. In that sense, the blind spot is one of the best examples of how seeing is not simply receiving what the retina records. It is constructing a coherent visual world from what the nervous system can gather, plus a good deal of intelligent interpretation. If someone wants to notice the blind spot, it can be demonstrated with a simple setup. Close one eye, fix the open eye on a specific mark, and position another mark in the appropriate part of the visual field. At a certain distance, the second mark disappears. It falls right onto the optic disc, where no photoreceptors exist. The first time people see this happen, it often feels faintly unsettling, as though the eye has been caught keeping a secret. But really it is the visual system showing one of its normal hidden limitations. It works so well that its compromises rarely come to attention. The optic disc itself is more than just an empty patch. It is also a place doctors examine carefully because it reveals important information about eye and nerve health. When someone looks into the eye with specialized instruments, the optic disc can be seen as a pale, circular region on the retina. Its color, shape, margins, and the appearance of the central cup within it all matter clinically. Swelling, pallor, unusual cupping, or bleeding around the disc can signal problems with the optic nerve. Pressure inside the eye, blood flow, or even conditions affecting the brain. The exit path for visual information is not merely a cable port. It is living tissue that can reflect wider health. The optic nerve itself is sometimes described casually as if it were just one large wire, but it is better understood as a thick bundle made of the axons of retinal ganglion cells. These axons carry the processed output of the retina. By the time information enters the optic nerve, the eye has already done a surprising amount of work. Light has been caught by rods and cones, shaped by retinal circuits, and encoded into patterns of activity among ganglion cells. The optic nerve carries those patterns onward. It is less a raw optical pathway and more a neural reporting route. There are over 1 million nerve fibers in each optic nerve. That number gives some sense of how much information the eye is constantly sending. Even though consciousness feels calm and unified, the underlying traffic is enormous. Brightness, contrast, edges, movement, colour-related signals, and spatial relationships are all being packaged into neural activity and sent forward in parallel. The optic nerve is therefore one of the busiest routes in the body, though it does its work in absolute silence and without any dramatic signage warning of heavy visual traffic ahead. It also reveals something important about the status of the retina itself. Because the optic nerve is made from the axons of retinal ganglion cells, and because the retina develops as an outgrowth of the brain, the retina is really part of the central nervous system. The eye often seems like a separate organ that merely sends messages upward, but in developmental and neural terms, the retina and optic nerve are brain tissue extended outward. That makes the back of the eye a more intimate part of the nervous system than many people realize. The signals traveling through the optic nerve do not all mean the same thing. Different ganglion cells are tuned to different kinds of visual information. Some respond especially well to contrast, others to motion, others to certain aspects of fine detail or temporal change. The retina has already divided up part of the scene into channels of information, and the optic nerve carries those channels onward together. This means that the eye is not sending a simple untouched photograph into the head. It is sending a coded report, a structured account of patterns in the visual world. As the optic nerve leaves the eye and heads back toward the brain, it passes through surrounding tissues and travels toward the optic chiasm. where some of the fibers from each eye will cross. That crossing matters because the brain organizes visual information not by eye alone but by visual field. Information from the right visual field of both eyes is eventually processed together in the left side of the brain, and information from the left visual field is processed in the right side. This arrangement sounds complicated at first, but it supports binocular vision and the coordinated handling of the world as a shared scene, rather than two completely separate eye-specific movies. Before those signals reach the chiasm, though, they remain bundled in the optic nerve of each eye. That bundle must stay healthy and functional, because if the optic nerve is damaged, the information from the retina cannot reach the brain properly, no matter how good the optics of the eye may be. This is one reason optic nerve disease can be so serious. A beautiful cornea, a clear lens, and an intact retina are not enough if the exit path fails. Vision depends on successful relay as much as on successful detection. Glaucoma is one of the most important examples of this. In glaucoma, damage to the optic nerve often occurs gradually, frequently associated with pressure-related stress, though the full story can be more complex than simple pressure alone. What matters for experience is that optic nerve fibers are lost over time. This typically affects peripheral vision first, which is one reason glaucoma can advance quietly. People may feel that central vision is still fine, while parts of the wider visual field are slowly shrinking. Because the brain fills gaps so effectively and because vision remains binocular in daily life, the loss may go unnoticed until it becomes significant. That is another reminder that visual awareness is a constructed experience. Considerable damage can occur before a person becomes aware of what is missing. Optic neuritis is another condition that affects this exit path in a different way. Inflammation of the optic nerve can reduce vision, alter colour perception, and cause pain with eye movement. Here the retina may still be able to detect light, but the nerve carrying the information is impaired. Colours can seem washed out, vision may dim, and the connection between eye and brain becomes unreliable. This can feel especially strange because the eye itself may look relatively normal from the outside. Again, sight is reminding us that it depends on the whole chain, not just the visible front of the organ. Because the optic nerve is packed so densely with fibers, even small changes can matter. Swelling at the optic disc can interfere with normal function. Reduced blood flow can injure fibers. Compression from nearby structures can alter the signal. The eye may still gather the world perfectly well, but the departure gate has become compromised. In biological systems, the bottlenecks matter, and the optic nerve is very much a bottleneck in the best and most serious sense. Everything the retina wants to tell the brain must pass through it. There is also a slightly humbling aspect to the blind spot and optic nerve when considered together. The eye is often imagined as a flawless window onto reality, but here right at the exit point we find an unavoidable patch of missing data, and a narrow bundle through which all visual reporting must pass. The system is powerful, but it is not omniscient. It does not give you an absolutely complete recording of the world. It gives you a highly useful, intelligently edited and biologically constrained one. The blind spot is proof of the constraint. The optic nerve is proof of the ongoing relay. And yet the brain makes such elegant use of this imperfect arrangement that ordinary sight feels anything but compromised. The two eyes overlap. The blind spots sit in different places. The brain fills small gaps. Eye movements keep sampling the world. What could have felt like a glaring limitation becomes almost invisible in daily life. This is part of the genius of the visual system. It is not built from perfection at every individual point. It is built from clever coordination among imperfect but highly capable parts. The optic disc also has a structural role in relation to the nerve fibers leaving the eye. The fibers bend and converge there, passing through a sieve-like structure in the eye wall. This region is mechanically and physiologically important because it is one place where pressure, support, and tissue organization all matter. It is not just a hole in the retina. It is a carefully arranged passage through living tissue. When that arrangement is stressed over time, as in glaucoma, the delicate balance can be disturbed and nerve fibres may be lost. The visual consequence of losing optic nerve fibres is not always immediate darkness in a neat, tidy patch. The effect can be more selective and more gradual. Contrast sensitivity may change. Parts of the field may weaken. Colour richness may fall. The sharpness of transmission can diminish. This again reflects the fact that the optic nerve is carrying many kinds of encoded information, not just a single brightness map. Damage changes the report. The brain then has less to work with. Still, under healthy conditions, the optic nerve performs with astonishing reliability. Every moment the retina is active, those ganglion cell axons are carrying signals out of the eye at extraordinary speed. The outside world becomes patterns of light. Those patterns become retinal activity, and then the optic nerve carries the results onward with no need for your permission or attention. It is one of the great silent thoroughfares of everyday life. The page you read, the face you know, the path you walk, the lamp in the room, the edge of the blanket, all of it has left the eye this way. There is something almost satisfying in the fact that vision requires this act of departure. Light enters, but information leaves. The front of the eye is about admission. The back is about transmission. The blind spot marks the price of having an exit. The optic nerve marks the route by which the eye stops being a receiver and becomes a messenger. Without that messenger, the most elegant retina in the world would remain isolated. This also helps explain why the eye alone does not truly see in the fullest sense. It gathers, processes, and sends, but the brain must interpret. The optic nerve is the bridge between those domains. It carries the eye's carefully prepared account into deeper visual pathways, where meaning, recognition, depth, motion interpretation, and conscious visual experience will become more complete. The retina catches the world. The optic nerve delivers its report. The brain decides what sort of world that report describes. So here, at the edge of the eye, we find both a gap and a gateway. The blind spot reminds us that human vision contains a built-in absence. The optic nerve reminds us that every image detected by the retina must leave through a single bundled route. One represents what the eye cannot detect. The other represents how the eye communicates what it can. Together they show that seeing is not just about the arrival of light, but about the organized departure of information. And once that information has left the eye, the story of vision is no longer mainly inside the eyeball at all. The signals move onward into the brain's visual pathways, where input from both eyes will be sorted, compared, recombined, and transformed into the stable, meaningful world you actually experience. A world far more complete than any one retina could provide on its own. Once the signals leave the eye, something important changes in the story of seeing. Up to that point, we have mostly been dealing with light, tissue, optics, and the first stages of translation. The cornea bends incoming light, the pupil regulates brightness, the lens adjusts focus, the vitreous gives the image a clear path, the retina catches the light, and the optic nerve gathers the finished retinal signal into a travelling report. All of that is essential, but none of it, by itself, is the full experience of sight. The eye does not hand you a finished world. It hands the brain a carefully prepared set of signals, and then the brain takes over. That matters because most people naturally think of vision as something done by the eyes. It is an easy assumption to make. Eyes look outward. Eyes are visible. Eyes move toward what interests us. When someone loses their glasses, they do not usually say their visual cortex is having a difficult afternoon. They say their eyes are not working properly. But in truth, the eyes are only the front end of the system. They gather information. They do some impressive early processing. Then they send the result onward. What you consciously experience as sight depends just as much on what happens in the brain as on what happens inside the eyeball. This becomes clearer the moment you ask a very simple question. What exactly is the brain receiving from the eyes? It is not receiving tiny photographs in the ordinary sense. It is not looking at a little screen inside the head like a scientist in a control room. The optic nerves carry patterns of neural activity, coded signals shaped by the retina. These signals contain information about brightness, contrast, edges, movement, colour, and spatial arrangement. The brain then has to organise that information into something stable and useful. It has to combine input from both eyes, align the two views, infer depth, track motion, identify objects, recognise faces, separate figure from background, and maintain the impression that the world is steady even while the eyes themselves are jumping around several times each second. That is not a minor finishing step. That is most of the miracle. The first major destination for visual information after it leaves the eyes is a structure deep in the brain called the lateral geniculate nucleus, or LGN, which sits in the thalamus. The thalamus is often described as a relay station for sensory information, and while that phrase can sound a bit dry, it captures something useful. The brain does not usually let signals just wander in and see what happens. It routes them. It sorts them. It sends them onward in organised ways. The LGN receives visual information from the retina and passes it along to the primary visual cortex at the back of the brain, in the occipital lobe. But relay does not mean passive forwarding. Even at this stage, the signals are being handled with selectivity and structure. One of the most interesting things about this pathway is that the brain is not organising vision simply by eye. It is organising it by visual field. Information from the right side of the visual world ends up being processed mainly in the left side of the brain, and information from the left side of the visual world ends up mainly in the right side. That crossing begins at the optic chiasm, where some fibres from each eye switch sides. This arrangement may sound awkward at first. The sort of thing only biology could design after a long meeting with no whiteboard. But it allows the brain to bring together corresponding information from both eyes about the same part of the world. Since the two eyes view overlapping scenes from slightly different positions, this arrangement helps support binocular vision and depth perception. By the time the visual signal reaches the primary visual cortex, often called V1, the brain is ready to begin something more than transport. It begins analysis in earnest. The primary visual cortex is located at the back of the brain, which surprises some people. We tend to think of seeing as a front-facing business, because the eyes are in the front of the head. But the major cortical processing of sight begins in the occipital lobe, at the back. So in a way, the world enters at the front and becomes visible through work done in the rear. The body is not always interested in matching anatomy to common sense. V1 is especially important because it starts extracting structured visual features from the incoming signal. Certain neurons respond preferentially to edges of particular orientations. Some respond best to lines at one angle, others to another. Some are sensitive to motion in a specific direction. Some respond to patterns, contrast boundaries, or specific spatial arrangements. This means that by the earliest cortical stages, the brain is already breaking the visual world into components. It is not asking, what is this entire object in one grand leap? It is starting with simpler features, lines, edges, contrasts, directions, local patterns. That may sound inefficient until you realize it is exactly what allows more complex recognition later. The brain builds upward from features toward objects. This is one reason vision is not like projecting a complete scene onto an inner theatre screen. The brain does not simply receive a finished image and admire it. It constructs perception out of organised pieces of information. It detects edges because edges help define form. It tracks contrast because contrast helps separate one thing from another. It registers orientation because the visual world is full of structured surfaces and boundaries. In a way, the brain begins by asking not, what am I seeing, but where are the useful differences? From there, visual information travels onward into additional cortical areas beyond V1, and this is where the picture becomes even more interesting. Different regions of the brain become more specialized for different aspects of seeing. Broadly speaking, visual processing splits into two major streams, though in real life they interact constantly. One is often called the ventral stream, which runs more toward the lower parts of the brain's visual regions and is involved in identifying what things are. The other is often called the dorsal stream, which runs more upward and is involved in where things are and how they are moving. These streams are sometimes described as the what pathway and the where or how pathway. The ventral stream helps you recognize objects, faces, letters, shapes, and categories. It answers questions like, is that a cup, a cat, a carrot, or an unfortunately shaped lamp? The dorsal stream, by contrast, helps locate objects in space and guide action. It answers questions like, where is it, how far away is it, and how should I move to reach or avoid it? This split makes daily life possible in ways people rarely notice. You do not just need to know that a mug is a mug. You need to know where it is so you can pick it up without knocking it over. This division of labour becomes especially revealing when damage affects one stream more than the other. Some people can see an object well enough to describe it, but cannot guide their hand towards it accurately. Others can reach toward an object reasonably well, but cannot identify what it is in the normal sense. These unusual cases show that vision is not a single monolithic ability. The brain is doing multiple kinds of visual work at once, and those kinds can come apart under the right circumstances. That tells us something profound. Seeing is not one thing, it is a bundle of coordinated achievements. Take face recognition, for example. There are regions in the temporal lobe, especially an area often called the fusiform face area, that are strongly involved in processing faces. Faces matter so much in human life that the brain seems to dedicate special resources to them. Recognizing a face is not the same as recognizing a chair or a spoon. Faces carry identity, emotion, intention, and social meaning. We are exquisitely sensitive to small changes in facial structure and expression. When this system is disrupted, a person may still see that a face is present but struggle to recognize whose face it is. This condition, called prosopagnosia, or face blindness, is one of the clearest examples of how the brain completes vision in specialized ways. The eyes may be fine, the person may detect eyes, nose, and mouth, but the sense of that face belonging to a particular person is lost or weakened. Something similar can happen with motion. Certain brain regions are particularly important for processing movement. Damage there can produce a striking condition in which motion becomes difficult to perceive normally. Instead of seeing smooth movement, the world may appear as a series of still frames or jumps. Pouring tea or crossing a street becomes unnerving because the usual flow of motion is missing. Again, the eye may still detect light and shape, but the brain is no longer completing that part of the visual experience properly. All of this means that what you see is never just what lands on the retina. It is what the brain manages to organize from what lands on the retina. And that organization includes combining the two eyes into one scene. Since each eye has a slightly different viewpoint, the brain compares the differences between them to extract depth. This is stereopsis, the basis of binocular depth perception. It allows the visual system to judge how far away objects are with fine precision, especially at close and moderate distances. Without the brain's ability to align and compare the two retinal images, the world would feel flatter. The eyes provide the two views. The brain creates the depth. This comparison must happen with extraordinary speed and accuracy. The images from the two eyes are similar but not identical. The brain must match corresponding points in the two images and infer spatial relationships from the differences. That sounds like an exhausting amount of work, and in a computational sense it is. Yet the nervous system does it constantly without complaint. Well, mostly without complaint. It may occasionally complain if you stare at one of those badly designed 3D images from the 1990s, but under ordinary circumstances it performs with remarkable grace. It also stabilizes the world against your own movements. This part is easy to miss because it works so well. Your eyes move all the time, your head moves, your body moves. You walk, turn, nod, blink, shift posture, glance from one point to another, and yet the world does not appear to lurch and blur uncontrollably every few seconds. The brain combines visual input with information from the muscles controlling the eyes, from the inner ear, and from other body systems to maintain a stable sense of the world. Some of this happens through reflexes, such as the vestibulo-ocular reflex, which helps keep your gaze stable when your head moves. Turn your head to one side and your eyes automatically move in the opposite direction to help keep the visual scene steady. Without this, walking around would feel like trying to watch a film while someone shakes the screen. This stability is one of the great hidden gifts of the visual brain. It means you do not experience sight as a chaotic stream of fragments. You experience a world that appears calmly present and mostly dependable. The fact that this experience is constructed does not make it fake. It makes it impressive. The brain also handles colour in a way that goes far beyond simple wavelength detection. The cones in the retina respond to different parts of the visible spectrum, but colour as you experience it is the result of cortical interpretation, comparison, and constancy mechanisms. This is why a banana looks yellow in morning light, afternoon light, and indoor light, even though the exact mix of wavelengths reflecting from it can vary. The brain is not just measuring raw input, it is estimating what property of the object is likely to remain constant across changing conditions. This is called colour constancy, and it is another example of vision serving usefulness rather than literalism. The brain is trying to tell you what the thing is like, not simply what wavelengths happen to be arriving at this exact second. This practical approach to vision appears everywhere. The brain fills in missing information. It smooths over the blind spot. It compensates for shadows. It helps separate object from background. It predicts likely structure from incomplete cues. It uses context heavily. Most of the time, this makes vision robust and efficient. Occasionally it leads to illusions, but illusions are not embarrassing mistakes for the brain. They are clues about the assumptions it normally uses to build a workable world. Consider how quickly you recognize an object from partial information. A cat half hidden behind a chair is still clearly a cat. A familiar face seen briefly in poor light is often still recognized. A word with one letter obscured may still be read without effort. The brain is constantly making educated guesses based on past experience, context, and expectation. Perception is therefore not a passive receipt of facts. It is an active best estimate of what is out there. This predictive quality of vision explains why expectations can influence what we notice. If you are looking for your keys, objects of the right size and colour may suddenly stand out. If you are in a forest, your brain becomes especially sensitive to shapes that resemble animals or people. If you're reading, letters are processed in the context of likely words. The visual brain is never starting from nothing. It is always bringing prior knowledge to the scene. That helps life move quickly, though it also means you can overlook something obvious when it falls outside what you're expecting. The eyes may receive it. The brain may decline to promote it to full awareness. Attention plays a major role in all of this. You do not consciously experience every detail that reaches your eyes. The brain selects. Some things are emphasized, others ignored. A scene may be full of objects, colors, and motion, but only part of it enters focused awareness at any one moment. This is why inattentional blindness can occur, where a person fails to notice something quite visible because attention is directed elsewhere. The visual brain is not in the business of giving equal importance to everything. It is in the business of supporting relevant action and understanding. Even reading, which feels like a straightforward visual act, is actually a triumph of brain processing layered onto eye function. The eyes direct text onto the fovea, but the brain must recognize letter shapes, combine them into words, attach meaning, and integrate them into sentences. Special regions in the left hemisphere become highly involved in this for literate adults. There is nothing inevitable about this process. Human brains did not evolve specifically for reading in ancient prehistory. Reading recruits and trains visual and language systems together. That is why written language can feel so natural once learned, and yet depends on a remarkable amount of coordinated neural work. The same is true for object recognition more generally. Seeing a chair is not just detecting lines and colours, it is understanding that those lines and colours belong together as a particular object with a familiar function. The brain must group features, compare them to stored patterns, and assign meaning. That assignment happens with extraordinary speed. Within fractions of a second, the world becomes populated not by meaningless shapes, but by things: door, lamp, hand, cup, face, cat, tree, spoon, pillow, ceiling. That transformation from visual features to meaningful objects is one of the brain's greatest quiet performances, and it is happening now all the time with every glance. The eyes do not tell the brain, "Please find attached one fully interpreted room." They send structured signals. The brain turns those signals into the room. This is also why damage in the brain can produce strange visual disorders even when the eyes themselves remain healthy. A person may be able to see colours, but fail to interpret them normally. Another may see objects but not recognise their meaning. Another may have difficulty processing motion, or spatial layout, or faces, or written words. These conditions are powerful reminders that sight is not finished at the eye. The eye begins the process, the brain completes it. In a very real sense, what you experience as the visual world is a brain-built model continuously updated by incoming signals from the eyes. That phrase model should not make the world sound unreal. It simply means that perception is constructed. The brain takes the best available evidence and turns it into a stable representation that helps you live, act, and understand. This representation is so reliable that it usually feels direct. But its reliability depends on intense hidden labour. That hidden labour includes timing. Visual processing has to happen quickly enough for action. You cannot wait several thoughtful seconds to decide whether the approaching object is a bicycle or a kitchen stool. The brain processes vision rapidly and in parallel across many regions. Some pathways help with immediate action, such as reaching or avoiding. Others help with recognition and interpretation. These processes overlap and inform each other. The result is that you can both know what something is and respond to where it is quickly enough for daily life to proceed without disaster. There is something deeply comforting in that. Even while you rest, even while your attention softens, the visual brain is built for order. It takes the chaos of incoming light and turns it into a coherent world. It compares the eyes, fills the gaps, stabilizes motion, infers depth, identifies objects, tracks the important parts, and hides the seams so well that you almost never notice the construction happening. The world simply appears, and because it appears so effortlessly, it is easy to forget how much nervous system is standing behind that effortless feeling. So when we speak about how you actually see, we eventually arrive here, beyond the eye, in the brain's secret work. The eyes gather light. The retina begins the code. The optic nerves carry the report. But the brain is where the report becomes a world. It is where edges become objects, colours become surfaces, two viewpoints become depth, movement becomes smooth, and scattered features become the face of someone you know. And once all of that is understood, even in broad outline, it becomes easier to appreciate just how strange and beautiful the whole process is, because by now we're no longer talking about a simple organ looking outward, but about light becoming perception through a chain of living structures that ends not with the eye, but with the brain quietly turning signals into sight, and in that quiet transformation lies the gentle final thought waiting at the edge of rest. There is something quietly humbling about the fact that for most of your life, you have been surrounded by light and have almost never stopped to think about what it takes for that light to become a world. It arrives without introduction. It touches the surfaces around you, reflects from walls and windows and hands and trees and books and faces, and then enters the eye with such ease that the whole process feels like a single act. You open your eyes, and there things are. A room, a ceiling, a lamp, a page, the faint line of a blanket, the shape of a door in the half-dark. It feels immediate, simple, almost automatic. But now that we have followed the path more carefully, it is difficult not to feel a little differently about it. Seeing is not just opening the eyes. Seeing is the result of a long, beautifully coordinated chain of events in which light is welcomed, shaped, measured, focused, carried, detected, translated, sent onward, and finally made meaningful. At the very front of the eye, the process begins with surfaces so clear and quiet that they often go unnoticed entirely. A smooth tear film coats the eye and helps prepare the first optical boundary. The cornea bends the incoming light and does much of the early focusing work. The iris and pupil regulate how much brightness may pass inward, constantly adjusting to the changing conditions of the world. The lens changes shape so that near things and distant things can each find their way into focus. Behind it, the vitreous chamber holds the eye open and lets the focused light continue its journey without interference. At the back, the retina catches what has arrived. Rods and cones respond to the pattern of light. The macula and fovea deliver the finest detail where your attention falls most directly. The optic nerve gathers the retinal report and carries it away from the eye. Then the brain receives all of this and quietly turns it into something astonishingly familiar, the visible world. That is perhaps the strangest part of all. The thing you call sight does not exist in the same form anywhere along the way. There is no tiny finished picture sitting on the retina waiting to be admired. There is no little observer in the head looking at a private screen. There is light, then chemistry, then electrical signaling, then processing, then comparison, then interpretation. And somewhere within that long sequence, the room appears, the face appears, the page appears, the night outside the window appears. The world you move through each day is not merely copied into you. It is assembled through cooperation between the eye and the brain, between the laws of optics and the needs of a living nervous system, between what is physically present and what the brain must infer in order to make a stable scene. There is something almost tender in the way the body handles this task. It does not demand your supervision. It does not ask for instructions every time you look up from a book or glance toward a familiar face. It simply works. The pupils respond to brightness. The lens adjusts for distance. The eyes move so the center of the retina can examine what matters most. The brain compares the two eyes and gives you depth. It fills in the blind spots. You do not have to spend your days staring at a permanent hole in your own visual field. It keeps the world stable while your eyes jump from point to point. It uses memory and context to help recognize what lies before you. And it does all of this with a kind of practiced calm. 1,000 little acts, all performed in silence, every waking moment. That silence is part of why sight can feel ordinary. Anything done well enough for long enough begins to disappear into the background. Breathing is like that. Balance is like that. The steady work of the heart is like that. Vision belongs in the same company. It is one of the body's great continuous performances, and because it rarely stops, it rarely gets applause. Yet when you pause and look more closely, it becomes almost impossible not to admire it. Light from the outside world enters a living organ made of transparent tissues and fluid chambers, passes through structures that remain clear despite being alive, reaches cells that can turn photons into signals, and then travels into the brain where those signals become shape, motion, color, texture, distance, and meaning. If someone described that process coldly on paper, it might sound technical. But lived from the inside, it is something close to miraculous. Even the limitations of the system make it more interesting rather than less. Human vision is powerful, but it is not total. You do not see every wavelength. You do not see every detail equally well across the visual field. You do not notice everything that reaches your eyes. You have blind spots. You are vulnerable to illusions. Color is interpreted. Depth is constructed. Attention chooses what rises fully into awareness. At first glance, these facts might seem disappointing, as though they reveal the system to be partial or flawed. But really, they reveal its purpose. The visual system was not built to produce a perfect philosophical record of reality. It was built to help a human being live. It is practical. It is selective. It is efficient. It gives you the kind of world a human nervous system can use. That is why the center of your vision is sharp while the edges are less precise. That is why you can recognize a face yet fail to notice something unimportant sitting beside it. That is why a dim object may be easier to detect out of the corner of your eye than when you look straight at it. That is why colors seem stable even as the light around them changes. Vision is shaped not only by what is out there, but by what a body needs from what is out there. The eye and brain together give you a world suited for reading, reaching, walking, avoiding danger, finding people, recognizing food, following movement, and understanding space. In that sense, seeing is not passive observation. It is a useful interpretation. There is a comforting thought in that, especially at night, when the world becomes softer and less sharply defined. In dim light, vision changes. Rods contribute more, cones less. Colour quiets down, detail withdraws a little. The edges of things grow gentler. The room becomes less about exact surfaces and more about broad forms and shadows. Many people find that change soothing without fully knowing why. Perhaps part of the reason is that vision itself is becoming less strict. The world no longer insists on every crisp line. It relaxes into shape and suggestion. The eye has a daytime way of seeing and a nighttime way of seeing, and each reveals something different about what the visual system values under changing conditions. During the day, it favors precision. At night, it favors enough light, enough shape, enough movement, enough awareness to move safely and remain oriented. It is not trying to deliver midday detail in midnight conditions. It adapts, and in that adaptation there is a kind of wisdom. The body is always balancing demands. It knows when to sharpen and when to soften, when to narrow the pupil and when to widen it, when to rely on cones and when to hand more responsibility to rods. It does not fight the environment in a rigid way. It responds to it. And that, in a broader sense, is what makes vision feel so alive. A camera can record an image. An eye cannot help but participate in one. It adjusts to brightness. It shifts focus. It moves toward what matters. It tires, it waters, it blinks, it adapts, it ages, it changes over a lifetime. The lens stiffens. The vitreous drifts. The pupils respond a little more slowly. The world still enters, but it enters through tissues that carry time within them. Perhaps that is part of why sight feels so personal. The world is seen not only through optics, but through a body, through your body, through tissues that belong to you, shaped by your age, your history, your attention, your habits, your health, and your experience. Even memory plays its part. The visual brain is never meeting the world as a stranger. It brings knowledge to every scene. It knows what a face tends to look like, what a chair tends to be, what a page of text is for, what a doorway means, how shadows behave, how objects continue to exist even when partly hidden. It uses these expectations constantly. That is why you can recognize things so quickly, why partial glimpses are often enough, why the world feels coherent instead of endlessly confusing. Of course, this also means perception can be fooled. The brain may guess wrong, it may fill in too much, it may miss what it was not prepared to see, but even those mistakes reveal something generous about perception. It is always trying to help. It is always trying to turn fragments into a world that makes sense. There is also something lovely in the fact that vision depends on trust between distant parts of the body. The front of the eye must trust the back. The retina must trust the optic nerve. The optic nerve must trust the brain. The brain must trust signals coming from two slightly different eyes and merge them into one scene. Every part depends on the others. The cornea cannot see without the retina. The retina cannot make experience without the brain. The brain cannot interpret what never reached it. Sight is teamwork from surface to cortex. No one structure gets to claim the whole achievement for itself. That may be why the phrase, opening your eyes, feels both correct and incomplete. Yes, you open your eyes to the world, but the world only becomes visible because so many hidden things are already in place. Transparent tissues clear enough to guide light, photoreceptors ready to respond, neural pathways intact and waiting, brain regions tuned to edges, movement, form, colour, depth, and identity. Even the muscles around the eye are part of the accomplishment, turning your gaze so the fovea can examine what matters most. It is not really the opening of the eyes that makes the world appear. It is the entire living system behind that opening. When you think of it this way, everyday sight begins to feel less casual. Looking out a window in the morning, finding a cup on the table, reading a line of text, seeing someone you love enter a room, catching the movement of rain against glass, watching light move across a wall near evening. These are not small things just because they happen often. They're ordinary in frequency, not in complexity. The visible world is a gift produced continuously by anatomy and electricity, by fluid and tissue, by motion and interpretation. And because it comes so freely, it is easy to forget what it costs the body to provide it. Still, the body seems content to provide it. The eye does not complain each time it shifts from near to far. The retina does not demand recognition for turning light into code. The brain does not announce every time it fills your blind spot, stabilizes the room, or turns two flat retinal images into depth. The work continues without ceremony. This is perhaps one of the quiet lessons hidden inside anatomy. Some of the most extraordinary things in life are maintained not by grand events, but by constant, unnoticed care. That thought fits gently with bedtime. At the end of the day, the visual system begins to ease its pace. The eyes may grow dry or heavy. The details of the room soften. The lids lower more often. Brightness becomes less welcome. The world, which has poured itself into you all day in the form of light, gradually asks less of your attention. The same eyes that searched, scanned, read, judged distances, found faces, followed roads, read labels, watched screens, and measured space now begin to quiet. They are still able to see, but they no longer need to work at full effort. The body begins to prepare for a different kind of awareness, one less tied to sharp edges and visible surfaces. There is something reassuring in that softening. Vision is one of the busier senses during waking life. It gives so much, so constantly, that perhaps it deserves a gentler role as night settles in. The pupils widen to low light. The rods take more of the burden. The sharp centre yields a little to shadow and shape. The visual brain still works, of course, but the demands of precise seeing begin to lessen. The room can simply be the room. The ceiling can be the ceiling. The faint glow from outside can remain just a glow. Not everything needs to be inspected, and yet, even in that softness, the deeper truth remains. Light is still becoming sight. The same ancient path still holds. The tear film still smooths the eye. The cornea still bends the incoming rays. The lens still offers its focus. The retina still waits. The optic nerve still carries its quiet traffic. The brain still completes the world. Even now, perhaps especially now, when the mind is less busy and the body is closer to rest, it is possible to feel how beautiful that chain really is. Not beautiful in a dramatic or decorative way, but in the way well-made things are beautiful, in the way systems that work together with quiet precision are beautiful, in the way the body, left to its own practiced wisdom, so often knows exactly what to do. So the next time you look at something simple, a page, a hand, a curtain moving slightly in evening air, a lamp beside the bed, a line of moonlight on the floor, it may feel a little less ordinary. Not heavier, not grander, just more fully noticed. Light touched it. The eye received that light. The brain turned it into something you could know. That is what has been happening all along. Not a trick, not a metaphor, but a real passage from world to perception, from photons to experience, from outside brightness to inward meaning. And perhaps that is a gentle enough thought to keep beside you as the room grows quieter. That all day long, without asking anything from you, your body has been turning light into a world. It has been gathering brightness, shaping it, translating it, and offering it back to you as colour, form, distance, and recognition. It has done this faithfully from morning until now. And as your eyes begin to rest and the visible edges of things become softer, that hidden labour can go on a little more quietly still, the world easing into shadow, the brain loosening its grip on detail, the whole long path of seeing settling down with you into the dark.